The body bag came in at 4:47 in the morning. Nobody on the night shift flinched. They'd seen enough of those. What made the ICU go quiet wasn't the bag. It was the soldier behind it, barely 24 years old, chest torn open from shrapnel, blood pressure cratering faster than the monitors could track. The trauma team looked at each other. The chief surgeon hadn't arrived. The resident was shaking, and the supervising nurse on duty, the one everyone called the ghost, the one they handed mop duty and ignored at staff meetings, was already at the bedside, gloved, eyes clear, moving like she'd done this 1,000 times in places these people had never heard of. Nobody questioned her. There wasn't time. Before the story goes any further, if you're already hooked, drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit that like button, follow for every part, and don't you dare leave before the end. This one is going to shake you. The hospital's official name was Mercy Crest Medical Center, and it sat at the edge of Dellwood, a mid-sized Colorado city that prided itself on its hospital the same way small towns pride themselves on their football teams, loudly, without much scrutiny of what actually happened inside. Mercy Crest had 4 ICU bays, a Level 2 trauma designation, and a reputation that looked better on paper than it functioned in practice. The parking lot was always full. The waiting room was always loud. The break room coffee machine had been broken for 11 months, and nobody had filed the repair request because everyone assumed someone else had. Sarah Voss had worked there for 6 years. She had started as a travel nurse, taken a permanent position when her contract ended because the mountains made her feel something she couldn't name, and spent the last 3 years as a staff ICU nurse on the overnight rotation. She was 38 years old. She had dark circles she stopped trying to hide somewhere around year 4. A ponytail that never sat quite right because she'd cut her own hair with surgical scissors the last time she'd been too tired to drive to a salon. And hands that were steady in ways that had nothing to do with coffee. The other nurses called her Voss, if they bothered addressing her at all. Most of the attendings called her nothing. They looked through her the way people look through furniture, registering its presence only when it was in the way. Her supervisor, a 31-year-old charge nurse named Marlo Diaz, had a talent for making 6-word sentences feel like formal reprimands. Voss, rooms 4 and 7 need restock. Voss, you're covering Garcia's break. Voss, the family in Bay 2 is upset again, and I need someone to absorb that. Sarah absorbed it. She always absorbed it. She had a skill for making herself small that people in this building mistook for submission, when it was something else entirely. Something closer to patience or strategy, or the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that most battles aren't worth fighting until the right moment arrives. She restocked rooms 4 and 7. She covered Garcia's break. She sat with the family in Bay 2 for 40 minutes and said the right things in the right order. And when she came back to the nursing station, Marlo was standing at the desk with the expression she wore when she wanted an audience. Dr. Holt wants the vital summary for the post-op in Bay 3 reformatted. Different template. Says the current one is hard to read. Sarah looked at the clock. 40 minutes left in her shift. Which template? I don't know, the one he likes. Figure it out. There were 2 other nurses at the station. Neither of them looked up. Sarah pulled up the file, found the template, reformatted it in 7 minutes, and left it in the queue without saying anything about it. This was the rhythm of her days. Not dramatic, not explosive, just the steady accumulation of tasks that appeared from nowhere and disappeared into the general fog of the hospital without acknowledgement, without a thank you, without anyone stopping to ask whether the nurse who somehow knew exactly what every attending needed before they asked for it had ever done this work somewhere else, under different circumstances, at different stakes. She had, but Sarah Voss did not talk about that. The morning she'd been hired, the nursing director, a woman named Phyllis, who retired 8 months later, had looked at Sarah's application and paused at the employment gap. You were military? Combat medic, 3 deployments. Iraq? 2 there. 1 in a place I can't name on a form. Phyllis had nodded like she understood, though Sarah was fairly certain she didn't. We don't get many veterans applying for bedside positions. Usually they go for the management track or administration. I like bedside work. Any reason you left the service? Sarah had looked at her steadily. Medical discharge. Shrapnel injury, left shoulder, healed fine. Full range of motion. It's in the documentation. Phyllis had moved on. She hadn't followed up. No one at Mercy Crest ever followed up, which suited Sarah precisely. She didn't wear her history like a badge. She didn't mention it in staff meetings or use it to deflect criticism. She kept it packed away in the same internal compartment where she kept everything from that chapter of her life. The specific smell of a forward operating base at 0300. The weight of a trauma kit in her hands while a helicopter burned 50 yards away. The sound of a particular soldier's voice saying her name like it was a prayer right before she got the bleeding to stop. 6 years in. 2 combat deployments that officially existed. One that didn't. She had come back with a Purple Heart she kept in a shoebox under her bed, a service record that was partially classified, and a functional dissociation from fear that people at Mercy Crest interpreted as coldness or incompetence, or the blankness of someone who simply didn't care enough to be stressed. Dr. Reginald Holt, the chief of surgery, 54, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who walked into rooms like he was inaugurating them, had once said to a resident, loudly enough for 3 nurses to hear, "Voss has the affect of a woman who gave up somewhere around 35. Technically, adequate, nothing more." The resident had laughed. Sarah had been standing 6 feet away reading a chart. She had not looked up. Ichem. The soldier came in on a Tuesday in October, which was also the night Marlo Diaz had assigned Sarah a double shift with 2 hours' notice because Garcia called out sick again and, "You never seem that tired, Voss, honestly." His name was Corporal Danny Reeves. 23 years old, active duty, home on emergency family leave when the car accident happened. Not a battlefield injury, just a wet highway and a pickup truck that crossed the center line at 60 miles an hour and caught the driver's side of the rental car like a linebacker hitting a quarterback who never saw it coming. The paramedics had done what they could. The notes from the rig said GCS-9, BP 74/40, suspected tension pneumothorax, mechanism of injury consistent with significant thoracic trauma. He was intubated in the field. His oxygen saturation was bad and getting worse. Sarah was at the charge desk when she heard the radio traffic, and something in the cadence of the paramedic's voice, the particular clipped urgency that comes from a professional trying not to sound panicked, made her set down the restock clipboard and turn toward the bay. The trauma team was supposed to consist of Dr. Holt, but Holt was in surgery on a scheduled case and had sent his first-year resident, Marcus Webb, 27 years old, 2 months out of medical school, a very smart young man who had chosen the wrong night to be the senior physician in the room. Marcus was already gloved when the gurney came through the doors. He took one look at the monitor readings and went slightly pale. "Okay," he said, mostly to himself. "Okay." "BP's 58/30, one of the paramedics said. "Dropped in the last 4 minutes." Right. Marcus reached for the trauma assessment checklist, the way people reach for familiar objects in unfamiliar rooms. Sarah stepped up beside him. She had already looked at the chest. The asymmetry was visible even through the trauma gown, left side barely moving, right side working too hard to compensate. She had clocked the distended neck veins. She had heard the muffled breath sounds before anyone put a stethoscope to his chest. "Tension pneumo," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus looked at her. "Left side," she said. "He's going to arrest if we don't decompress it in the next 2 minutes." Yes, I was." He looked at the chest. He looked at the monitor. "I need Dr. Holt." "Dr. Holt is in surgery. You have 2 minutes, Dr. Webb." There was a beat, one of those pivotal, crystalline moments in emergency medicine where the room seems to hold its breath, and everything depends on what comes next. Marcus Webb was a smart young doctor. He was also terrified. Those 2 facts were fighting each other in real time, and Sarah could see the struggle on his face with absolute clarity. "Talk me through it," Marcus said quietly. It was not a question. It was an admission, and it cost him something, and he made it anyway, which told Sarah something important about him. 14-gauge needle, she said, already moving. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. I'll set you up. She was already at the supply cart. Gloves are in your left pocket, she said without looking. Second drawer, trauma kit. Open the alcohol prep now. The other nurses in the room had gone very still. Not frozen, still. The difference mattered. Frozen people don't move when you need them to. Still, people are watching, waiting for direction, ready. Garcia. She used the name of the nurse closest to her out of habit before correcting herself. Reyes, bag him manually. I need to see chest rise. Now. Nurse Reyes bagged. The chest rose on the right side. Left side's not moving, Reyes confirmed. I know. Sarah handed Marcus the needle. You're doing this. I'm right here. Landmark first. Second rib, go superior margin to avoid the bundle. Feel it? Marcus's hands were shaking slightly. He found the landmark. His hand steadied. I feel it. Go. He went. The hiss of air was immediate and dramatic, the sound of a system under catastrophic pressure suddenly finding release, like a tire blowing in reverse. The oxygen saturation on the monitor climbed, slowly, then faster. The blood pressure began to stabilize. There, Sarah said. Nobody cheered. That wasn't how it worked. The monitors just showed better numbers, and the paramedics let out a long collective exhale, and Marcus Webb stood with a needle in his hand, looking at the improving readouts like he needed a moment to believe them. Chest tube's going to need to follow, Sarah said. He'll need imaging before we confirm the full picture, but the immediate crisis is managed. You need to call Dr. Holt out of that OR. Right. Marcus pulled off his gloves. His hands were still shaking, but differently now. The shake of adrenaline aftermath rather than fear. Right, yes, good call, Voss. Really, that was... Make the call, she said. He made the call. The attending who finally appeared was not Dr. Holt. It was Dr. Lorraine Page, the senior trauma surgeon on backup call, who arrived 12 minutes later with the particular efficiency of someone who had been interrupted mid-sleep and had decided to be annoyed about it. She assessed the situation, reviewed Marcus's notes, the notes that attributed every decision to Marcus Webb, and declared the intervention sound. Good work, Webb, she said. Solid instincts. Marcus opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Sarah. Sarah was writing in the nursing notes. She did not look up. She knew exactly what had just happened. She had watched it happen before, in other rooms, in other countries, under circumstances that made this hallway look like a vacation. People in authority see the person they expect to see doing the work. Marcus Webb was standing in scrubs with gloves half off and an expression of authority. Sarah Voss was writing in a chart at a nursing station. The math was simple and wrong, and she had long stopped being surprised by it. What she was instead was tired in a specific way. Not physically, not the kind of tired that sleep fixed, but the kind that accumulated in layers over years, like sediment, like the slow weight of being consistently, systematically unseen. She finished her notes. She filed them. She went to take her 15-minute break, the first one of the shift, and sat in the supply closet on an overturned bin and ate a granola bar she'd had in her pocket since 7 that morning. Her shoulder ached the way it always ached when the weather was turning. The shrapnel hadn't come all the way out. There was still a fragment lodged near the scapula that the surgeons had decided wasn't worth the retrieval risk, which meant Sarah Voss carried a piece of an IED in her body every day, which felt, at times, like an accurate metaphor for something she couldn't quite articulate. She ate the granola bar. She checked her phone. She had 2 texts, one from her sister asking about Thanksgiving plans, one from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a pharmacy reminder about a prescription refill. She went back to work. Ishimek. Corporal Danny Reeves stabilized overnight. By morning, he was intubated but breathing on his own effort, sedated, his chest film showing the cleared tension pneumothorax and the rib fractures that had caused it. His family arrived around 7. A mother who looked like she hadn't slept, a younger sister who couldn't stop touching his hand, a father who stood in the corner of the ICU bay with the particular stillness of a man trying very hard to hold himself together. Sarah was still on shift. The double had stretched because they were short-staffed, because they were always short-staffed. She gave the family the update in plain language, without condescension, without the performative optimism that families could always detect, and that never helped anyone. He's stable, she said. The injury to his chest was serious and was treated quickly. The next 24 hours matter, but he's going in the right direction. The mother grabbed Sarah's hand. Thank you, she said. Sarah didn't tell her that she'd done anything specific. She just said, he's a strong kid, and meant it, and moved on to the next bay. It was on that same morning, while Sarah was charting in Bay 2, that she heard Marlo Diaz at the nurse's station talking to someone from administration. Webb handled it beautifully, Marlo was saying. Very impressive for his level. Dr. Page was very complimentary. Sarah kept charting. The family has already sent a card, Marlowe continued, to the trauma team. Dr. Page is forwarding it to Webb's file. Sarah wrote down a potassium level. She wrote down a medication administration time. She was a very good nurse, and part of being a very good nurse was knowing which battles to fight and which ones to let pass. And she had made a calculation, one she'd made before, in different rooms with higher stakes, that this was not the moment. The moment when it came would be unmistakable. She just had to be patient. 4 days passed. Danny Reeves came off the ventilator on day 2. He was confused at first the way post-intubation patients often were, fighting the breathing tube on extubation, grabbing at hands. Sarah talked him down. She did it efficiently, without drama, using the tone she'd learned in a combat hospital overseas, steady, low, factual, the tone of someone who has been in worse places and come back. You're in a hospital. You were in an accident. You're safe. Stop fighting and breathe. He stopped fighting. He breathed. By day 3, he was lucid enough to talk, and on day 4, he was sitting up and asking for his phone. His mother had barely left the waiting room. The younger sister brought a plant that was slightly too large for the windowsill, but nobody said anything about it. Sarah was not his primary nurse during the day. She was nights and the overlap shifts. But she checked his chart, the way she checked the charts of patients she'd helped stabilize, because she had learned in the field that the work didn't end when the crisis passed. She noticed the notation about his unit, Special Operations. She read the unit designation twice, not because she was surprised. She'd seen his military ID on admission and clocked it then, but because seeing it written out in the chart made something shift slightly in the internal compartment she kept closed. She knew that unit, not abstractly, not by reputation. She knew it the way you knew the names of places where people had died saving your life. She closed the chart. She went to check on a different patient. She did not go back to base 6 for the rest of that shift. Well, on the morning of day 5, Marlowe called her into the supervisor's office. The office was small and had a motivational poster on the wall that said, "Teamwork makes the dream work," in a font that was trying too hard. Sarah sat in the chair across from Marlowe's desk and waited. Marlowe was 31 and had been a nurse for 4 years before moving into management, which meant she was the kind of manager who had just enough clinical experience to think she understood everything and not quite enough to understand what she didn't know. She had good hair and a habit of clicking her pen that she seemed entirely unaware of. "I've been getting some feedback," Marlowe said. Sarah waited. "About your communication style, specifically in the trauma bay during the Reeves case." "What about it?" "Dr. Webb felt that you were," his word was directive, "that you were issuing commands rather than offering suggestions. In a collaborative environment, the patient's BP was 58/30, Sarah said. There wasn't time for suggestions." Marlowe clicked her pen. "I understand that, but there's a way to support the attending physician that doesn't undermine their authority in front of the team." Sarah looked at her. "I'd like you to review the collaborative communication module," Marlowe said. "It's 3 hours online. I'll put the link in your email." "Marlowe," Sarah said the name quietly, not with heat. If I had waited for a collaborative discussion, that soldier would have arrested on the table. "I hear you," Marlowe said in the tone of someone who did not hear her, "but Dr. Webb is the attending. In the future, the proper channel is to provide information and let the physician make the call." Sarah nodded once. "Is that all?" "For now, yes." Sarah stood. She left. She did not look at the motivational poster on her way out, though she was aware of it in her peripheral vision. She went to the break room. She poured the terrible coffee that had come from the machine that wasn't broken anymore. Apparently someone had finally filed the repair request. And she stood at the window and looked at the parking lot and thought about something that had happened 9 years ago on a night with no moon, in a situation with no good options, where she had made a decision in the space of 4 seconds that saved 11 people. No one had asked her to review a collaborative communication module after that. She finished the coffee. She threw the cup away. She went back to work. She was in the middle of a medication pass on day 6 when she heard the voices in the corridor. Not raised voices, the opposite. A low, controlled kind of conversation that happened between people who were used to communicating in controlled environments. The kind of voices that made you look up before you understood why. She looked up. At the end of the hallway, near the ICU entrance, stood two men in military dress uniforms. Not the working uniforms she recognized from her own service years. The formal ones, the kind you wore to ceremonies, to funerals, to official visits. They were speaking to the hospital's patient liaison coordinator, a nervous young man named Todd, who was nodding too fast in the way people nodded when they didn't know what else to do. Sarah recognized the insignia on the nearer man's collar before she recognized anything else about him. Special Operations Command, senior level. She couldn't see the rank clearly from this distance, but the bearing was unmistakable. The particular way of holding oneself that was the accumulated result of years of doing work that didn't announce itself. She went back to the medication pass. She was very careful. She checked every label twice. She documented every administration in real time, the way she always did, because careful documentation was what she had instead of sleep. But in the back of her mind, something that had been quiet for 6 years was beginning, very slowly, to wake up. The second set of visitors arrived the next morning. By then, word had gotten around the unit the way word always got around the unit, not through official channels, but through the particular grapevine that existed in every hospital, the one that ran on break room speculation and hallway glances and the things you overheard while pretending to chart. Military visitors, several of them, coming to see the soldier in Bay 6. Marlowe had already organized a small reception plan. She had a gift for organizational responses to things she didn't fully understand. She'd spoken to Dr. Holt, who had expressed interest in being available for the visit, which Sarah noted with the same flat internal register she applied to most things Holt did. She was assigned to a different section of the unit that morning. Bay 6 was not her assignment. She would have no particular reason to be near it. She understood what that meant. Marlowe was not subtle. Sarah took her assignment. She checked her patients. She did her work with the steady, unhurried focus that people in this building had spent 6 years calling blankness. And that was, in fact, the opposite of blankness. It was clarity, the kind that came from knowing exactly what mattered and exactly what didn't. At 9:14 in the morning, she was in Bay 3, checking a central line, when she heard the doors at the end of the ICU open with the particular weight of a group of people entering a space together. She did not look up. She finished checking the central line. She documented it. She moved to the next task on her list, a dressing change in Bay 2. She was halfway down the corridor, dressing supplies in hand, when she heard boots on the floor behind her. Not the soft-soled shuffle of nurses or the brisk slap of a physician's dress shoes. Boots. The real kind. She kept walking. "Excuse me." The voice stopped her before her brain fully processed the instruction to stop. It was a voice she had not heard in 9 years, lower than she remembered, older. But the cadence was identical, precise, quiet, with a particular weight behind the words that she associated with a specific hillside in a country she couldn't name on a form. She turned around. The man standing up the corridor was 50 years old, approximately, though he carried it differently than most people carried 50. Broad shoulders, iron gray hair cut short above ears, dress uniform immaculate. He was flanked by 2 others, also dress uniform, also very still. His eyes found her face. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise. He had known he would find her here. He had come specifically to find her. What moved through his expression was something else, something that took a moment to name. It was relief. "Staff Sergeant Voss," he said. The corridor was not empty. There were nurses at the station 12 feet away. Todd, the liaison coordinator, had materialized somewhere behind the group. Marlowe Diaz was standing near the entrance to the break room with an expression that suggested she was trying to understand a situation that was moving faster than her frameworks could handle. "Colonel Ashworth," Sarah said. Sarah, his name came out of her like something she'd been holding for a long time. Not dramatically, just easily. The way you said a name you'd never actually forgotten. "It's General now," he said, "as of last year." "Congratulations, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the dressing supplies in her hands. Then he looked at the hospital corridor around them. The fluorescent lights, the nursing station, the hallway of an ICU in a mid-sized Colorado city. Then he looked back at her face. "We've been looking for a reason to come," he said. "That soldier in Bay 6 gave us one." He's improving, Sarah said. He'll recover fully. I know he will. General Ashworth's voice had shifted. Something in it had gone very quiet and very deliberate. Because you were here. Marlowe made a sound. It was involuntary, the kind of sound made by someone realizing they have fundamentally misread a situation, but made too late to matter. General Ashworth turned slightly. He looked at the corridor, at the nurses who had stopped pretending to work, at the doorway of the break room, at the general geography of a floor that had no idea who it had been working beside for 6 years. Then he turned back to Sarah. He brought his heels together. The sound was sharp and definitive in the quiet corridor. He raised his right hand to the brim of his cover in a salute that was, by any military standard, flawless, the kind that took years to produce, the kind that carried meaning in its execution, the kind that was not given to people who did not deserve it absolutely. Behind him, both officers came to attention simultaneously. 3 men in dress uniform, standing in an ICU corridor, saluting a woman in scrubs holding wound dressing supplies. Sarah stood completely still for one moment. Then she straightened her spine, a tiny adjustment, almost imperceptible, but the nurses who were watching would remember it later as the moment the whole axis of the floor seemed to shift. She transferred the dressing supplies to her left hand. She brought her right hand up. The salute she returned was not rusty. It was not hesitant. It was the salute of someone who had never, not once, forgotten what it meant. "It's good to see you, General," she said. Marlowe Diaz stood in the doorway of the break room with her pen halfway to her clipboard and did not move for a very long time. The silence in that corridor lasted approximately 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Marlowe Diaz was the first one to move, which was perhaps inevitable. Marlowe had a deep biological resistance to situations she wasn't controlling, and 4 seconds of total stillness was about her limit. She stepped forward from the break room doorway with her clipboard held slightly in front of her like a shield, and her expression arranged into something she probably intended to look professional. "General, welcome to Mercy Crest. I'm Marlowe Diaz, charge nurse for the ICU. We weren't expecting. That is, we knew you were coming, obviously, but we weren't notified of the exact—" "Thank you," General Ashworth said, without looking at her. He was still looking at Sarah. Marlowe's sentence trailed off the way sentences did when the person you were addressing made it structurally clear that you were not the relevant person in the room. She glanced at Sarah. Something crossed her face. Not quite recognition, not yet, but the first distant rumble of it. The way you feel a change in barometric pressure before you understand what it means. "Voss," General Ashworth said, "walk with me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite an order either. It was the particular phrasing of someone who had known you long enough to trust you'd follow without requiring either. Sarah set the dressing supplies down on the nearest surface, a rolling cart someone had left in the hallway, and fell into step beside him. The 2 officers flanking Ashworth adjusted their positions automatically, moving into the loose configuration of people trained to always know where everyone in a room was standing. Todd, the liaison coordinator, made a noise somewhere behind them, and nobody acknowledged it. They walked to the end of the corridor, away from the nursing station, away from Marlowe, away from the specific gravitational pull of the ICU floor that had been Sarah's entire world for 6 years. Ashworth stopped near the window at the hall's end. The view was unremarkable. The hospital's east parking lot, a row of dying maples, the gray October sky doing nothing interesting. "You look tired," he said. "I worked a double." "How long have you been here, at this hospital?" 6 years. He took that in the way he took most information, not reacting immediately, processing it against something internal. "I looked for you when you separated, tried to track the placement. I moved a few times before I settled. Colorado wasn't on my radar." "That was the general idea," Sarah said. He almost smiled. "Almost." "Same as always." For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the silence had a different quality than the one in the corridor. It was the silence of people who had shared experiences that didn't compress easily into conversation, who understood that some things didn't need to be said because they'd been lived. "Danny Reeves," Ashworth said. "He's recovering well." "I know. I read the medical summary on the drive from Peterson." He looked at her directly. "I also read the incident report that Marcus Webb filed." Sarah said nothing. "He listed himself as the primary decision-maker for the chest decompression." That's consistent with his role as the attending physician. Ashworth looked at her for a long moment. Sarah. Sir? You and I both know what happened in that trauma bay. She met his eyes. Outside, a car pulled into the parking lot below, and the driver spent an unusually long time deciding which space to take. Sarah watched it without really seeing it. What I know, she said carefully, is that the patient is alive and improving. That's the outcome that matters. That's the outcome, he agreed, but that isn't the whole story. In my experience, the whole story rarely fits neatly into incident reports. No, he said, it doesn't. He paused, which is why I'm here to tell it differently. Whatever Sarah had expected from that conversation, and she had, in the small honest corner of her mind, expected something, had felt it coming in the way she'd learned to feel incoming situations, it wasn't what followed. Ashworth didn't explain immediately. He told her he'd be meeting with hospital administration that afternoon, that he'd brought documentation she wasn't to worry about for the moment, and that he needed her to do exactly one thing. Stay visible, he said. Don't make yourself small today. She almost said that making herself small was a 6-year-old habit, and habits didn't dissolve in a morning. She didn't say it. She said, understood. And he nodded, and she went back to her dressing supplies on the cart in the hallway. Marlowe was waiting at the nursing station with the energy of someone who had been waiting for several minutes and was not happy about it. What was that about? He wanted to check on Corporal Reeves. He could have done that through the liaison coordinator. I know. Voss. Marlowe's voice had shifted. There was something under it now. A particular frequency that Sarah had learned to identify as uncertainty, trying to sound like authority. What is your history with that man? He's a general in Special Operations Command. That's not what I asked. Sarah looked at her. Not with challenge, not with the particular sharpness that would have made this a confrontation. Just directly. I was a combat medic for 6 years. I served under people in that command structure. That's the extent of what I can tell you, Marlowe. Marlowe opened her mouth. I have a dressing change in Bay 2, Sarah said. She picked up the supplies and walked away. The rest of the morning had a strange quality to it. The floor was hyper-aware of itself in the way floors got when something had shifted, but no one could yet define what. Nurses who normally moved through their routines on autopilot were glancing toward the ICU entrance. The overnight resident who was supposed to be sleeping had apparently not left the building. Even Dr. Reginald Holt, who ordinarily materialized only for rounds and post-operative check-ins, appeared at the nursing station at 11:15 with a studied casualness that fooled nobody. Sarah saw him there when she came back from Bay 2. He was reviewing a chart he almost certainly had no clinical reason to review, wearing the look of a man who had heard something that required him to be present without appearing to specifically need to be present. He was 61 years old, Reginald Holt, chief of surgery at Mercy Crest for 9 years, the kind of physician who had been very good at his work once and had gradually replaced active competence with the armor of institutional seniority. He had a reputation, which was not the same thing as a record. He had the corner office, the named exam suite, the photograph in the hospital lobby that showed him shaking hands with the state governor from 4 years back. He had, on 3 separate occasions over the past 6 years, referred to Sarah as the overnight girl in meetings she was also attending. She didn't acknowledge him when she passed the nursing station, not pointedly, just the way you didn't acknowledge furniture. She heard him say her name. Voss. She turned. Who exactly were those men this morning? Military officers, she said. They're here to see Corporal Reeves. The patient in Bay 6. Yes. And they're interested in speaking with you specifically? I was the nurse on duty during his admission. She held his gaze without effort. They had questions about his initial presentation. Holt looked at her with the particular expression of a man running calculations he didn't have all the variables for. He was smart enough to know something was happening that he didn't fully understand. He was also, in Sarah's assessment, not quite smart enough to understand that his not understanding it was itself diagnostic. Right, he said. Well, keep me updated. Of course. She turned and kept walking. The afternoon meeting between General Ashworth and hospital administration was, by all accounts from the people who witnessed pieces of it, not what the administration had expected. Sarah wasn't in the meeting. She was on the floor, doing her job, which now included a new admission in Bay 4. An elderly man named Frank, who had come in with a COPD exacerbation and was anxious and frightened and needed someone to sit with him for a few minutes and talk to him about his breathing in plain language while the bronchodilator worked. She sat with Frank for 9 minutes. She explained what was happening in his airways using an analogy about garden hoses that she had developed over years, because the medical textbook language didn't help frighten people, and frightened people needed help more than they needed accuracy of terminology. Frank calmed down. His oxygen saturation came up. He made a joke about his wife not believing he'd actually come to the hospital, and Sarah laughed at it because it was genuinely a little funny. She was back at the nursing station charting Frank's assessment when Marlowe appeared from the direction of the administrative corridor with the look of someone who had just attended a meeting that had reorganized her understanding of several things simultaneously. She stopped at the station. She looked at Sarah. "The administration wants to speak with you," she said. 3 o'clock. "I have a med pass at 3. I'll cover it." That, more than anything else that had happened that morning, told Sarah that something had shifted in a structural way. Marlowe Diaz did not cover med passes. Marlowe Diaz managed the people who did med passes. "All right," Sarah said. "Sarah?" Marlowe's use of her first name was notable. She almost never used it. "Is there anything you want to—" She stopped, reorganized. "Is there anything I should know before this meeting?" Sarah considered her. Not unkindly. Marlowe was not a bad person. She was a person who had been operating on a set of assumptions about the relative importance of the people around her. And those assumptions were in the process of being dismantled, and dismantling was uncomfortable. And Sarah had enough experience with discomfort to have some sympathy for it. "I think," Sarah said, "that the meeting will explain itself." The administrative conference room at Mercy Crest had a long table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard with marker stains that hadn't fully erased, and a view of the hospital's front entrance. When Sarah arrived at 2:58, the people already seated were the hospital's CEO, a man named Warren Fitch, who wore good suits and had the carefully maintained confidence of someone for whom things had mostly worked out. The chief of medical staff, Dr. Pauline Greer, who Sarah respected moderately for her willingness to have difficult conversations, and only moderately because the conversations rarely produced change. And General Ashworth, with one of the officers who had been with him that morning. Dr. Holt was also there. He was sitting at the far end of the table with the posture of a man who had arrived expecting to be important and was recalibrating. Sarah sat in the chair indicated by Warren Fitch. She folded her hands on the table and did not fidget, because she had been in rooms like this, rooms where information was being decided and distributed and positioned, and she had learned that stillness read differently than anxiety. "Nurse Voss," Warren began, "thank you for coming. I think this conversation is, well, somewhat overdue, as it turns out." Sarah waited. "General Ashworth has shared some information with us this afternoon that provides, shall we say, significant context about your background and qualifications that weren't fully represented in your personnel file." She looked at Ashworth. "I requested that certain records be made available," he said simply, "things that were previously restricted." "My service record," she said. "Parts of it. The parts that are relevant." Warren cleared his throat. "Yes. Well, it appears that prior to your nursing career here, you had a remarkably distinguished military career as a combat medic. Multiple deployments, several commendations, and—" He glanced at the papers in front of him like a man reading a document he still wasn't sure he was interpreting correctly. "A Silver Star." The room was quiet. The room. Dr. Holt's expression had undergone a change that Sarah would not have been able to describe precisely, but that was recognizable as the physiological response to information that fundamentally alters a prior understanding. "Among other decorations," Ashworth said. "Among other decorations," Warren repeated. "Yes." He set the papers down. "Nurse Voss, Sarah, I think we need to have a frank conversation about the Reeves case." "All right," she said. Warren looked at Holt. Holt was looking at the table. Dr. Webb filed an incident report attributing the chest decompression decision and execution to himself. But General Ashworth has raised, based on his interview with Corporal Reeves, who has now been conscious and coherent for over 48 hours, some questions about that account. "Danny talked to you," Sarah said to Ashworth. He remembers very clearly what happened in that trauma bay, Ashworth said. He was semi-conscious during the decompression. He heard voices. He heard the decisions being made in real time. A pause. He described you. Holt made a sound. Not a word. A sound. The involuntary kind. I'd like to hear your account, Dr. Greer said. It was the first thing she'd said, and she said it with a directness that Sarah appreciated. Sarah looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked up. She told it plainly. She didn't editorialize, and she didn't perform modesty, and she didn't hedge with the qualifications that women in medical settings had learned to deploy as armor, the "I just thought maybe," and "it seemed like perhaps" phrasing that made real clinical assessments sound like guesses. She stated what she had observed, what she had concluded, what she had done, and why. It took about 4 minutes. When she finished, the room was quiet again. Dr. Webb, Warren said carefully, did not mention your involvement. No, she said. He didn't. Were you aware he intended to omit? I was aware of what his report would likely say when he filed it. Yes. And you said nothing. She looked at Warren Fitch steadily. I said nothing in that moment. I'm saying something now, son. Marcus Webb was called into the room at 3:47. He arrived looking like a man who had known this moment was coming and had spent the past several days trying to decide what to do when it arrived. He was 27 years old and he was not a bad person. Sarah had established that in the trauma bay when he'd asked her to talk him through it, which was the action of someone who cared about the patient more than his own ego, at least in the critical moment. What he had done afterward was more complicated. Fear was complicated. The protective instincts of a career just beginning were complicated. He sat down. He saw Sarah. He looked at the table. Dr. Webb, Warren said, we've reviewed the Reeves incident report. Yes, sir. We've also spoken with Corporal Reeves directly and with General Ashworth, who has provided additional context. Warren's voice was carefully neutral. Is there anything you'd like to add to or revise about your account? Marcus Webb was quiet for a very long time. 12, maybe 15 seconds. Long enough that it stopped being a pause and became something else. Then he looked up. Not at Warren. At Sarah. She saved him, he said. Not me. I froze. I knew what needed to happen, and I couldn't make my hands do it. His voice was level, though it clearly cost him something to keep it that way. She told me every step. She set it up, she talked me through the needle, and when it was over, she told me to call Dr. Page. The only thing in that report that's accurate is the timeline. The room absorbed this. Why did you file the report the way you did? Dr. Greer asked. Because Dr. Page congratulated me and I didn't correct her. And then I went to file the report and I kept thinking about how it would look. A first-year resident who froze and had to be walked through a basic procedure by a nurse. I thought... He stopped. I don't have a good reason. I was scared. That's all I've got. Holt pushed back from the table slightly. This changes the clinical liability picture significantly, and I think we need to... Reginald. Dr. Greer's voice was quiet and flat and extraordinarily effective. Holt stopped. I'll need a revised report, Warren said to Marcus. Accurate and complete. Today, please. Marcus nodded. He looked at Sarah again. I'm sorry. The patient is alive, she said. It wasn't absolution exactly, but it was what she had, and she meant it. The conversation that happened after Marcus left lasted another hour, and it was the kind of hour that felt like pressure applied steadily to a structural point. Not explosive, just relentless, the kind that eventually finds the fault line. General Ashworth was methodical. He had, it became clear, arrived at Mercy Crest not simply for a courtesy visit to a recovering soldier, but with preparation, with documents and a timeline and a specific intention that he had been courteous enough to deploy slowly, giving the administration room to absorb each element before the next one arrived. He talked about Sarah's service record in terms that were specific and unambiguous, and that Warren Fitch kept writing notes about with the energy of a man recalibrating a calculation. Silver Star, as mentioned, 2 Bronze Stars, a commendation for actions in a situation that Ashworth described in the same careful language used for things that official records acknowledged only obliquely. She had been a staff sergeant overseeing the medical response for a 12-person special operations element in a situation where the normal chain of medical command had been entirely severed, where she had managed 4 critically injured personnel over 6 hours in a forward position with no evacuation available, and where all 4 had survived. Sarah sat through this without expression, which was harder than it looked. Her discharge was medical, Ashworth said. Shrapnel injury that ended her field eligibility. Not her choice. I understand, Warren said. I want to be clear about something, Ashworth said. He looked at Warren and then at Holt in a way that was not aggressive, but was absolutely unambiguous. The decision Staff Sergeant Voss made in that trauma bay was not a nurse exceeding her scope. It was a combat-trained medical professional with more emergency intervention experience than most physicians in this building, making a life-saving call in a window that did not allow for deliberation. The fact that your institution has had her mopping floors and restocking supply carts for 6 years is something I'll be including in my report to the Surgeon General's office. The silence after that sentence had a different texture than the others. Holt's jaw had tightened. He was doing the arithmetic, the specific, unflattering arithmetic of what it meant that he had called this woman the overnight girl in meetings for 6 years, and that he was now in a room with a 2-star general who used phrases like report to the Surgeon General's office. General Ashworth, Holt said carefully, I want to be clear that the staff here holds Sarah in very high. Dr. Holt. Ashworth looked at him. Just looked. The way certain people could look at you and make all the things you were about to say feel like they were still in the room with you before you'd even said them. I'm going to stop you there. Holt stopped there. Sarah left the administrative conference room at 5:12 in the evening. The floor was into the afternoon shift transition, nurses she knew handing off to nurses she knew less well, the particular controlled chaos of end-of-day handovers. She walked to the nursing station and checked the status board and found that her bay assignments for the rest of the shift had been, without explanation, redistributed to 2 other nurses. Marlowe was at the station. She saw Sarah coming and straightened slightly. How was the meeting? Long, Sarah said. Is there anything? Marlowe started. Stopped. Tried again. Are you all right? It was the first time in 6 years that Marlowe Diaz had asked Sarah Voss if she was all right. Not because she had been callous, necessarily, more because it had simply never occurred to her to ask, the way it doesn't occur to you to wonder about the structural integrity of a bridge until something makes you look at it differently. I'm fine, Sarah said. Your assignments have been covered for the rest of the shift. Fitch's office. I know. She went to the break room. She poured coffee. She sat at the table and looked at the wall and did the thing she'd been doing intermittently all day, which was allowing herself to feel things in small, controlled increments rather than all at once. Because all at once was not an option she had the luxury of indulging. The silver star was in a shoebox under her bed. It had been there for 9 years. She had looked at it twice since she'd put it there. Once when she first separated, and once 3 years ago when she'd been having a very bad night, and had taken it out not to feel proud, but just to confirm it was real. That the person who had done those things was actually her, and not someone she'd invented. She drank the coffee. She thought about Danny Reeves, who remembered her voice in the trauma bay, even through sedation and blood loss and the specific confusion of a body in crisis, because the human mind held on to the things it needed to hold on to. She thought about Marcus Webb, who had told the truth when it cost him something. That mattered. Imperfect people did imperfect things, and then some of them found the spine to face it, and that wasn't nothing. She thought about Marlowe, who had asked if she was all right. She finished the coffee. She stood up. She washed the cup. The next morning arrived with an email from Warren Fitch's office requesting a follow-up meeting, and a text from a number she didn't recognize that turned out, on investigation, to be a hospital administrator named Donna that Sarah had interacted with approximately twice. The text said, "Please see your email. WF's office wants to discuss a formal role review." Sarah read it twice, put the phone down, made breakfast, scrambled eggs, slightly overcooked because she'd been reading the email again while the pan was heating and lost track. She ate the eggs. They were fine. She drove to the hospital in the pale morning light, the mountains to the west carrying their first real snow of the season on the upper elevations, white lines cutting across the gray-green of the upper pines. She had driven this route for 6 years, and mostly she saw it without seeing it, the way you stopped seeing things you passed every day. This morning, she saw it. When she pushed through the ICU doors at 6:45, the floor was doing the thing floors did at shift change. Controlled, slightly frantic, the outgoing nurses handing off to the incoming ones with the practiced shorthand of people who had done this enough times to compress an hour's worth of information into 12 minutes. She found her assignment sheet at the nursing station. Bay 6 was on it. She picked up the clipboard and the morning medication list and went to Bay 6. Danny Reeves was awake. He'd been moved from the ICU proper to a step-down room in the adjacent corridor, but the assignment had followed her. He was sitting up at about 40 degrees, color better than it had been, the chest tube site bandaged cleanly. His mother was in the chair by the window, asleep with her head against the glass. He looked at Sarah when she came in. "You're the nurse from the first night," he said. "I am. I remember your voice," he said. "Before I was all the way out. You were talking." He paused. "You were very calm." "Calmer than I felt," she said, which was not entirely true but was true enough to say. He watched her check his vitals, watched her review the overnight notes with the specific quality of attention that patients developed for the medical staff they trusted. Not passive, not anxious, just watchful, like they were taking their cues from how you moved through the information. "General Ashworth told me," Danny said, "about who you are." Sarah glanced up. "He didn't say details, just that you'd served, that you knew what you were doing in there." "He talks too much," she said. Danny almost smiled. It pulled at his side and he made a small involuntary sound. "Yeah, he mentioned you'd say something like that." She marked the vitals on the chart. His mother shifted in the chair by the window without waking. "Thank you," Danny said. "For, you would have been fine," she said. "That's what people say when they don't want you to feel like you owe them something." She looked at him. He was 23 years old, and he had the eyes of someone who had been paying attention to the world in the way people started paying attention when the world had been difficult with them. "Get some rest," she said. "Your numbers look good. If the drainage stays minimal, they'll pull the tube tomorrow." "Nurse Voss," he said. She turned at the door. "Whatever's happening out there," he gestured vaguely toward the corridor, toward the hospital in general, toward the administrative machinery that had been in motion for 18 hours. "I hope it goes the way it should." She held his gaze for a moment. "Get some rest," she said again. Chas. It was at 11:30 that morning, while Sarah was in the middle of documenting a care plan, that Holt appeared at the nursing station for the second time in as many days, and this time the casual pretense was gone. He had the look of a man who had made a decision and was doing the thing men like him did when they made decisions they were uncomfortable with, moving fast, projecting authority, trying to get ahead of something. He had Dr. Greer with him, and also the hospital's HR director, a woman named Paula, which was notable because Paula's presence at the bedside unit could only mean one thing. Sarah looked up from her charting. "We need a word," Holt said. The small conference room off the nursing station had room for about 6 people if they were comfortable with each other. Sarah, Holt, Greer, and Paula were not comfortable with each other, and there were 4 of them, so it was a tighter room than its dimensions suggested. Holt started before Paula had fully shut the door. "We've reviewed the Reeves incident thoroughly," he said. "Webb's revised report, the meeting with General Ashworth, all of it, and there are some real concerns that have come up about protocol." "What kind of concerns?" Sarah asked. "You performed a procedure that falls outside your scope of practice as a registered nurse." He said it clearly and quickly, with the energy of someone who had practiced it. The needle decompression, regardless of the outcome, was not sanctioned by an attending physician. Dr. Webb was present. Dr. Webb was in crisis, Holt said. He was not in a position to give informed authorization. He told me to proceed. "He told you to go. That is not a formal authorization of a procedure that legally requires physician execution." Sarah looked at Dr. Greer. Greer's face was carefully composed. Not blank, composed. There was a difference. She was the chief of medical staff, which meant she was sitting in a very uncomfortable position between institutional liability and something else, and she was not pretending otherwise. "We're not here to discuss termination," Greer said. "Let me be clear about that up front." Holt's jaw tightened slightly. That told Sarah something. "What we're here to discuss," Greer continued, "is a formal protocol review, which may result in a suspension of your floor access pending that review." A suspension, Sarah said. Paid, Paula added from the corner of the room, as if this were a significant concession. Sarah looked at the table, at her own hands, which were folded on it. The shrapnel in her shoulder gave a small, almost conversational ache. Pauline, she said to Greer. Greer met her eyes. If the board proceeds with a suspension, Sarah said, I want you to understand that I'll be pursuing this through every channel available to me. The nursing board, the Joint Commission, and I'll be speaking with General Ashworth, who has expressed an interest in how this institution handles its response to this case. The room was very quiet. That's not a threat, Sarah said. It's information. The same way telling you a blood pressure is 60/30 is information. You decide what to do with it. Holt's face had gone through several phases while she spoke and had arrived at something that wasn't quite anger. It was the face of a person confronting the specific discomfort of having systematically underestimated someone for years and being in a room with that person while that fact became undeniable. The review will be thorough and fair, Greer said. That's all I can promise you today. That's all I'm asking for, Sarah said. She stood. She straightened her scrubs. She looked at Holt one time, not with contempt, not with triumph, just with the particular directness of someone who had nothing left to hide and had therefore stopped needing to look away. She walked out. She was back at the nursing station in under 2 minutes, charting, when her work phone buzzed. It was a text from an internal number she didn't recognize. This is Marcus Webb. I heard what just happened. I need to talk to you. There's something else, something I didn't say in that meeting yesterday. I've been sitting on it for 5 days, and I can't anymore. Can we meet after your shift? She read it twice. Outside the nursing station window, the mountains held their fresh snow against a sky that had turned the specific shade of gray that preceded something significant. She had lived in Colorado long enough to know what that sky meant. It meant more was coming. She replied to Marcus Webb with 2 words: after shift. Then she put the phone face down on the nursing station counter and went back to her charting, because the charting needed to happen regardless of what was unraveling around it, and because Sarah Voss had learned long before Mercy Crest that the way you stayed functional in a deteriorating situation was to keep doing the small necessary things while the large things sorted themselves out. The afternoon passed in the way. Afternoons passed on the ICU floor when everyone knew something was happening, but nobody knew exactly what, with a surface normalcy stretched thin over a completely different undercurrent. Nurses talked to each other at half their usual volume. The respiratory therapist who came to check on the patient in Bay 4 lingered longer than necessary at the nursing station, which was not about the patient in Bay 4. Even the unit clerk, a teenager named Brandon, who was usually absorbed entirely in whatever he was doing on the computer, kept glancing toward the hallway with the alert stillness of an animal that had picked up a frequency it couldn't identify. Sarah did her med pass. She updated 3 care plans. She sat with the family of a post-operative patient in Bay 1 who had questions about the discharge process that turned out to be really questions about fear, which was what most discharge questions were when you listened to them correctly. She answered those too. At 6:45, with 15 minutes left in her shift, Marlowe appeared at the nursing station and said, with a deliberateness that suggested she had been rehearsing it, "Your suspension review is scheduled for Friday morning, 9 o'clock. You'll receive formal written notice by end of business today." "Thank you," Sarah said. Marlowe looked at her for a moment with an expression that had evolved considerably from its usual managerial flatness. There was something in it now that was almost apologetic, or trying to be, struggling against the institutional positioning that made apology complicated. "For what it's worth," she started. "Marlowe?" Sarah kept her voice even. "You don't have to say anything." "I know." A pause. "I know." Sarah clocked out. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, put on jeans and a gray thermal and the fleece she kept in her locker because the hospital parking lot at shift change in October in Colorado required a fleece. She texted Marcus. "Parking lot, west side, 10 minutes. He was there in 8. He was still in scrubs, blue resident scrubs, wrinkled from the day, and he had the look of someone who had not slept enough for several consecutive nights and had begun to wear it openly, the way people did when they stopped having the energy to conceal it. The parking lot was half empty at this hour, the mountain dark behind the tree line, the air carrying the specific cold, clean smell of incoming snow that Sarah had learned to like despite herself. "Thank you for meeting me," Marcus said. You said there was something else. He pushed his hands into his pockets, looked at the pavement, looked up. He had the quality of someone who had been building to something and was now at the point where the preparation ran out and only the actual thing remained. The night of the Reeves admission, he said, before the trauma bay, before any of it. He stopped. I was covering a patient in Bay 7, post-surgical, day 2, 46-year-old woman named Patrice Odom, abdominal resection. Sarah waited. Her vitals had been flagging all afternoon, nothing acute, just trending in a direction that needed watching. The day nurse had flagged it in the handoff. He swallowed. I reviewed the chart at around 8 p.m. Her potassium was low, not critical, 3.1, but the trend was wrong, and with her cardiac history it needed to be addressed. Did you order the replacement? I ordered it. A pause. I ordered it, and then I got pulled to an admit in Bay 2, and I didn't follow up. I assumed the nursing staff had executed the order and moved on. I was spread across 4 patients, and the admit in Bay 2 was complicated, and He stopped. I just didn't check. Sarah was very still. At 9:40, Patrice Odom went into a run of Torsades, Marcus said. VTAC. She was cardioverted. She's fine. She recovered. She was discharged 4 days later. There were no lasting effects. But the precipitating cause was the potassium, which had dropped to 2.7 because the replacement order I wrote was... He stopped. I wrote the wrong concentration, and nobody caught it. Not the pharmacist, not the floor nurse, not me. Was there an incident report? Yes. Filed as a near-miss event, attributed to a systems failure in order verification. Nobody was named specifically. He finally looked directly at her. I reviewed the chart afterward, and I found something I didn't report. The replacement order I wrote, the correct version, the one I intended, was in the system, but so was a second order, a duplicate with the wrong concentration that I must have entered by mistake and that nobody flagged as a conflict. Sarah said nothing for a moment. The cold was settling into the parking lot, the kind that came down from altitude and had no patience. That's a medication error, she said. Yes. An unreported medication error. The incident report filed it as a systems issue. The individual error, my error, was not documented. Who was the attending of record? His jaw tightened. Dr. Holt. She looked at the mountains. The first stars were appearing above the white-edged peaks in the specific cold clarity of high-altitude nights. She thought about Patrice Odom, 46 years old, post-surgical, who'd gone into a dangerous cardiac arrhythmia because a potassium order had been entered wrong and nobody had caught it, and who had recovered and gone home not knowing precisely how close the margins had been. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Because they're using protocol violation as the mechanism to suspend you. His voice had steadied into something harder. And I know exactly what Holt's doing. He's using the Reeves case to generate paper on you before Ashworth can generate paper on him. If there's a formal protocol review with your name on it, it changes the narrative. You become the person under investigation instead of the person who was right. She looked at him. And I have evidence, he said, that Holt signed off on an incomplete incident report, that the root cause analysis was managed, compressed. The pharmacy conflict flag was documented in the system and then deleted from the final report. I have the original system logs. How do you have those? I requested them when I was trying to understand what happened, before I understood what was being done with them. I have them on a personal drive. He pulled a hand from his pocket. He was holding a small USB drive, and the fact that he'd come to this parking lot with it already in his pocket meant he'd made this decision before he texted her, possibly days before. I thought about deleting them, he said. I thought about pretending I never saw the discrepancy. I'm a first-year resident, and Holt controls my evaluation scores, and his relationships go up through the department chair, and I know what this could mean for me. What changed your mind? She asked. I kept thinking about the trauma bay, he said, about how you talked me through it. Not talked me through, you made it simple. You reduced it to what mattered, what needed to happen, and in what order. And the whole time, you weren't doing it for any reason except that a 23-year-old kid needed his chest decompressed. He looked at the USB drive. He looked I don't want to be the person who lets you take the hit for what happened in there and then goes home and pretends he doesn't know what's on this drive. She looked at the drive in his hand. She thought about several things simultaneously in the way her mind had always processed compound situations. Tactically, sequentially, with the particular clarity that emerged when she stopped trying to manage her feelings about a situation and just assessed it as a problem with components and solutions. Then she reached out and took the USB drive. "Go home," she said. "Get some sleep. Don't tell anyone you spoke with me tonight." "What are you going to do?" "What needs doing," she said, in the right order. She drove home. She ate something, pasta, from a box, the kind that took 9 minutes and required minimal decision-making. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and spent 2 hours going through documents she had been keeping for a long time. Not because she had planned this specifically. She had not planned this. She had kept records the way she kept everything, methodically, without drama, because she had learned in the field that documentation was the difference between an account that could be verified and one that could be contested. She had kept personal notes on every clinical incident she'd observed or been involved in for 6 years. Not all of them were significant. Some were just the ordinary frictions of an understaffed floor, but some were not ordinary at all. She had a folder on Patrice Odom, not because she'd known about Marcus's error specifically, but because she'd been the nurse who administered the cardioversion support that night, who'd stood at the bedside while the crash cart was used, who'd watched the monitor with the knowledge that a potassium level that should have been corrected hours ago had not been, and who'd written in her personal notes that night, in handwriting she'd developed over years of field notation. Bay 7, VT event. K-Low. Replacement order delay? Check pharmacy log. Holt signed IO report. Felt incomplete. She had felt incomplete about many things over 6 years and had written them down. She had notes on a wrong site marking incident from 3 years ago that had been caught at the last moment by a circulating nurse and documented as a near miss, and then somehow not carried forward into the formal risk management database. She had notes on a patient who had been discharged against better clinical judgment because his bed was needed and who had returned 2 days later in respiratory failure, and the discharge note had been retroactively edited. She had the original copy because she'd printed it as part of her own handoff documentation before the edit happened. She realized, sitting at her kitchen table at 11 at night with cold pasta going stale beside her laptop. 6 years of documentation. She had been keeping a record without fully acknowledging to herself that she was keeping a record, the way you sometimes did the thing you needed to do before you consciously understood that you needed to do it. Tiens. Thursday came in cold and clear. The snow from the upper elevations having descended overnight to the hospital's elevation, a thin coat of it on the parking lot surfaces that the facilities crew had already begun to address by the time Sarah arrived at shift start. Her formal suspension notice had arrived via email at 4:47 the previous afternoon. Paid administrative leave pending protocol review. Effective end of business Friday. Temporary reassignment of patient care responsibilities. She had read it, filed it, and gone to bed. She arrived at the nursing station at the same time she always arrived, because the suspension was effective Friday and today was Thursday, and on Thursday she still had a job to do. The floor felt different. It had been feeling different since Tuesday, shifting incrementally with each new development, and by Thursday morning it had arrived at a quality she recognized, not from hospitals, but from operations. The specific atmospheric quality of a situation in which multiple parties are aware that something is about to become irreversible, and everyone is positioning relative to that knowledge. Marlowe was in early. That was unusual. "You received the notice," Marlowe said. It wasn't a question. "I did." "The Friday meeting. HR will be present. You're entitled to bring a representative." "I know." Marlowe hesitated. "Are you going to?" "I'm still deciding," Sarah said, which was not entirely true. She had decided several things in the preceding 18 hours. She was deciding in what order to implement them. She took her assignment. She went to work. At 9 in the morning, General Ashworth called her cell phone. She was on break in the supply closet. The same overturned bin, the same granola bar routine, though this one was chocolate peanut butter, which was an improvement. She answered on the second ring. "I heard about the suspension notice," he said, quickly. "I have people who pay attention." A pause. "I want you to let me handle this." "I know you do." Sarah. "Sir, with respect," She stopped. Chose the words carefully. I've been watching other people handle things in this building for 6 years. I have some things I'd like to try handling myself. A silence that had the quality of a man choosing between two responses. What do you have? He asked. Documentation, dating back to year 1. Medication errors, falsified incident reports, a discharge record that was altered retroactively. I also have system logs showing a suppressed pharmacy conflict flag from a near-miss cardiac event. How'd you get the system logs? A resident with a conscience. Another silence. Does this resident understand what he's walking into? He understood enough to show up in a parking lot in the dark holding a USB drive. I think he has a reasonable grasp of the situation. She heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh. The sound of someone who had known her long enough to find her exasperating in a way they had made their peace with. All right, he said. The Friday meeting. I want to be there. I'd rather you weren't. Sarah, if you're in that room, it becomes a military pressure situation. They respond to that with lawyers and institutional defensiveness. I'd rather they respond to me. She paused. Give me Friday. If it goes wrong, I'll call you Friday afternoon and you can bring whatever you want to bring on Monday. He was quiet for a long moment. I'm going to be in Delwood, he said finally. I'll be at the hotel across from the hospital. If you need me, you call. Yes, sir. And Sarah. His voice shifted. The formal register dropped about 3 degrees. For what it's worth, what you did 6 years ago, after the discharge, going straight back to patient care, that mattered. The way you went about it mattered. I just want you to know I see that. She looked at the supply shelves, at the neatly organized boxes of gloves, the stacked gauze packages, the IV tubing coiled in its plastic sleeves, the whole architecture of the small, important things. I'll call you Friday, she said. Marcus Webb found her at the nursing station at lunchtime, not to speak, just to pass by with the specific kind of deliberate non-acknowledgement that communicated more than acknowledgement would have. He looked well, less shattered than the parking lot. He had slept, or tried to. His hands were steady. She gave him the same non-acknowledgement back. It was a small exchange that contained something important, and both of them knew it. What she did not expect was what happened at 2 in the afternoon. She was in Bay 3, repositioning a patient, an elderly man named Harold, who had been in for 4 days with a hip fracture repair and had developed a pressure injury risk on his sacrum that required repositioning every 2 hours with documentation. She was in the process of the turn, Harold grumbling affectionately about the indignity of it, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the nursing station. Not the ordinary volume of a floor conflict. The kind of voices that cut through ambient noise because the people producing them had stopped managing themselves. She completed the repositioning, documented it, told Harold she'd be back. She came out to the corridor. At the nursing station, standing with the particular energy of someone who has pushed past the point of composure, was a woman Sarah had never seen before. Mid-50s, professional clothing, standing across the counter from the unit clerk with her hands flat on the desk in a posture that read as barely controlled. Behind her was a man in a suit who appeared to be an attorney based entirely on the combination of his briefcase and his expression. I need to speak with the nursing director, the woman was saying. Today. Not Friday. Not Monday. Today. Brandon, the unit clerk, was handling it with admirable, if panicked, professionalism. I can page charge nurse Diaz. Page her now, please. Can I ask who? Lenora Odom, the woman said. My sister was a patient here 4 months ago. Patrice Odom, Bay 7. The name hit Sarah like a specific pressure, concentrated and precise in the center of her chest. Lenora Odom, who had a lawyer with her, who was standing at the Mercy Crest ICU nursing station on a Thursday afternoon with the look of a woman who had done her homework and run out of patience. Sarah did not step forward immediately. She stood in the corridor and watched and assessed the way she assessed everything, for what was actually happening versus what it appeared to be happening. Marlowe materialized from somewhere and introduced herself to Lenora Odom, doing the Marlowe thing with the clipboard and the professional tone. Lenora Odom was not soothed by the Marlowe thing. The attorney put a business card on the counter. My client has obtained her sister's medical records, the attorney said, including the original incident report from her adverse event in October. She also has a second document, an internal document that appears to differ substantially from the filed version. Marlowe's face went through something complex. "We'd like to understand that discrepancy," the attorney said, formally, today. What followed was this kind of institutional response that hospitals produced when suddenly confronted with the simultaneous collapse of two separate containment strategies, people moving quickly in directions that were not quite coordinated, doors opening and closing with slightly too much urgency, the administrative corridor suddenly populated by people who had not been there 20 minutes before. Sarah watched it from the nursing station. She did her job. She answered her pager. She restocked Bay 3 because the restocking was due, and also because staying visible and doing ordinary work was, at this moment, one of the most clarifying things she could do. Paula from HR appeared at 2:48, then Dr. Greer, moving quickly from the direction of the administrative wing. Warren Fitch's assistant came to the nursing station and asked Marlowe for the Odom file, and Marlowe's expression, when she turned to retrieve it, was the expression of someone who understood that the situation they thought they were managing had in fact been managing them. At 3:15, Sarah's work phone rang. It was an internal number. Voss. Dr. Greer. "Can you come to the administrative conference room?" "I'm mid-shift." "I'll have Marlowe arrange coverage. Please come now." She took a breath. She set down what she was doing. She covered the immediate task with 2 sentences to the nurse nearest her. She walked toward the administrative corridor. The conference room had more people in it than the last time. Warren Fitch, Greer, Paula, from HR, the attorney she'd seen at the nursing station, Lenora Odom, who looked at Sarah when she entered with the specific sharpness of someone who had been building to a confrontation and was recalibrating the moment she understood who had just walked in. Holt was not there. That was significant. "Nurse Voss," Warren said, "please sit." She sat. "I want to be direct with you," Warren said. "This afternoon has involved some rapidly developing information. We're trying to understand the complete picture as quickly as possible." He looked at Lenora Odom. "Ms. Odom, this is Sarah Voss, one of our senior ICU nurses. She was on duty the night your sister was treated." Lenora Odom studied Sarah. "Were you her nurse that night?" "I was the assisting nurse during the cardioversion response," Sarah said. "I was not her primary." "Do you know what happened to her?" "I know what I observed." She looked at Warren. "And I know what I documented in my personal notes, which differ from the incident report that was filed." The attorney's pen moved. "Ms. Odom retained independent medical review," the attorney said. "The reviewer found evidence of a medication dosing error and a pharmacy conflict that should have been flagged during order review. The final incident report contains no reference to either." "I know," Sarah said. The room shifted. "You know," the attorney said, "I documented both concerns on the night of the event, in my own records." She looked at Warren. "I'd like to share those records with this group. I have them on my person." She had scanned them to her phone the previous night. She had been carrying them all day the way you carried things you might need. Not conspicuously, but ready. She put her phone on the table. She opened the relevant file. She turned it to face the center of the room. 6 years of notes. The Odom entry was on page 47. Lenora Odom leaned forward. "Why didn't you report this when it happened?" the attorney asked. Not aggressively. With genuine curiosity, the kind that had professional purpose behind it. "I was a floor nurse," Sarah said. "The incident report was filed by the attending of record. I noted my concerns in my own documentation because I had no official channel to contradict an attending physician's report without significant personal risk." And now? She looked at Warren Fitch, who was looking at her phone screen with the expression of a man whose morning had taken a direction he was going to be processing for a long time. She looked at Greer, who had her hands folded on the table and was absolutely not showing what she was thinking, which Sarah had come to understand as Greer's version of extremely active thinking. "Now," Sarah said, "the situation has changed." It had. It had changed in the corridor when 3 men in dress uniforms had saluted a woman carrying dressing supplies, and it had been changing since, in ways that were now arriving at consequence. "I have additional documentation," Sarah continued, "across multiple incidents spanning 6 years. She paused. "I'd like to be clear that my intention in sharing this is not punitive. It's corrective. These were patient safety issues that were managed in ways that prioritized institutional appearance over patient welfare. And I believe the families affected deserve accurate information, and the hospital deserves the opportunity to correct its systems. She said it carefully and meant it because that actually was what she believed, without the need for it to also destroy anyone, even the people who deserved some destruction. "There's something else," she said. The room waited. Dr. Holt is aware of at least 3 of these incidents. He was the attending of record for 2 of them and was notified of the 3rd. I have documentation of his sign-off on the altered incident reports. She met Warren's eyes. "I think before Friday's meeting, you should speak with Dr. Holt, and I think when you do, you should ask him directly about his role in each of these cases." Warren looked at Greer. Something passed between them. Not a conversation, but the compressed version of one. "The Friday meeting," Warren said slowly, "the suspension review, is something you'll want to reconsider," Sarah said. Not as a demand, as a statement of fact. She was back on the floor by 4:30. She finished her shift. She repositioned Harold in Bay 3, and he grumbled about it with exactly the same affectionate protest as before, which she found steadying. She updated her nursing notes with the precision she always brought to them, because precision mattered, and patience mattered, and the work didn't become less important because large things were happening around it. At 6 o'clock, while she was finishing charting, Marlowe stopped at the nursing station. "The Friday meeting has been postponed," Marlowe said. "Indefinitely." Sarah did not react visibly. "All right. Paula will be in touch." "Thank you, Marlowe." Marlowe hesitated. She had been hesitating more than usual lately. It was, Sarah thought, the behavioral signature of someone in the process of revising a fundamental assumption. "Voss?" "Sarah. I owe you an apology, several probably, for things I should have—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't see you clearly. I don't have a good reason for that." Sarah looked at her, at the person Marlowe actually was underneath the management clipboard, and the collaborative communication modules, and the pen she clicked without knowing she was doing it. Someone who had made the mistake of using her frameworks to evaluate people and had found that her frameworks were too small. "You're seeing clearly now," Sarah said. "That matters." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was something more practical, an acknowledgement that people could change their aperture when the evidence demanded it, and that the moment they did was the moment worth responding to. She finished her charting. She clocked out. She was in the locker room pulling on her fleece when her phone rang. Not Ashworth, not Marcus, not anyone she expected. The number was from a Washington, D.C. area code she didn't recognize. She answered. "Is this Sarah Voss? Former Staff Sergeant, 8th Special Operations Medical Battalion?" "It is." "Ma'am, my name is Colonel Petra Nolan. I'm calling from the office of the Army Surgeon General. I've been briefed on your current situation by General Ashworth." A pause, professional and precise. "I'm also calling because there's a formal inquiry being opened, not into you, into the documentation practices at Mercy Crest Medical Center. We've had your hospital flagged for some time as a recipient of military treatment referrals. Given your documentation and the pattern it suggests, we're treating this as a patient safety investigation with federal jurisdiction." Sarah sat down on the locker room bench. "Federal," she said. "Given the number of active duty and veteran patients who have received care at this facility, yes. We have standing to investigate." Another pause. "Ms. Voss, I want to be direct with you. The information you've provided, combined with what General Ashworth has shared in the independent medical review Ms. Odom commissioned, suggests a pattern of incident suppression that goes beyond individual errors. We believe this warrants a formal investigation." Sarah looked at the locker room door, at the ordinary institutional reality of it, the metal, the handle, the scuff marks at the base from years of feet. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Everything you have," Colonel Nolan said. "And I need to know, are you willing to be the primary witness?" Outside the locker room, somewhere on the floor she'd just left, the monitors beeped their rhythms and the nurses moved through their rounds, and the hospital breathed its complicated, imperfect, necessary breath. "Ms. Voss?" "Yes," Sarah said. She meant it without hesitation. What she did not know What she would discover 11 minutes later when she pushed through the locker room door and found Marcus Webb waiting in the corridor with his face the color of someone who has just heard something that changed the shape of the situation entirely, was that the day had one more development left in it, and it was not a small one. "They found something else," Marcus said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "In the database," he said, "when the Surgeon General's office requested access to the incident reporting system this afternoon, they flagged something immediately, something that wasn't in any of your notes, something that happened 8 months ago." He looked at her. "A patient died, Sarah. Post-surgical. Bay 7 again. And the cause of death in the official record," he stopped, swallowed. "It doesn't match the nursing notes. And the nursing notes were signed by you." The corridor was very quiet. "I didn't write those notes," she said. "I know," Marcus said. "That's the problem." Her name had been on notes she had never written. That was the specific shape of it, and Sarah stood in the corridor outside the locker room and let the shape settle into her understanding the way you let a diagnosis settle. Not reacting immediately, just holding it, turning it over, looking at what it implied. "Show me," she said. Marcus had the records on his phone. Screenshots from the database access the Surgeon General's office had requested that afternoon, forwarded to him by someone he didn't name and Sarah didn't ask about. She took the phone and looked at the nursing notes for a patient identified as Raymond Cass, 61 years old, admitted 8 months ago for a routine elective procedure, bowel resection, who had died on post-operative day 3, from what the death certificate listed as cardiac arrest secondary to respiratory failure. The nursing notes in his file were detailed, clinically precise, written in the documentation style Sarah had developed over years. She recognized the structure of it, the particular sequencing of assessment findings. Because you developed a fingerprint in your documentation the same way you developed one in your handwriting, and it was deeply personal and entirely distinctive. But she had not written these notes. She had not been assigned to Raymond Cass. She had not been working the shift during which the critical deterioration was documented. She could verify this because she had her own personal shift records. She kept those too, the same way she kept everything, because the habit of documentation was not something she turned on and off. What the notes described was a patient whose oxygen saturation had been declining for 6 hours before a physician was notified. The notes attributed that declining saturation to a nursing assessment that had been completed and had determined the values were within acceptable limits given the patient's baseline. That assessment had not been completed. The oxygen saturation had not been within acceptable limits, and the signature on the notes was a digital entry of her employee ID number and her name. She handed the phone back to Marcus. "When did Cass die?" she asked. 3 in the morning, 8 months and 4 days ago." "Who was the attending of record?" He looked at her. "Holt," she said. "Holt." She leaned against the corridor wall. Not from weakness, from the specific physical need to be in contact with something solid while she thought through the architecture of what she was looking at. Raymond Cass had deteriorated and died, and the documentation suggested a nurse had assessed him and found him acceptable, which meant the documentation suggested the nursing assessment had missed a 6-hour deterioration that any competent nurse would have caught, except the nurse listed had not assessed him. The nurse listed had not been in that bay that night. The documentation had been constructed to create the appearance of nursing failure in a situation where the actual failure had been something else. Had been a physician's response time, possibly, or a physician's decision, or a chain of decisions that someone had needed to obscure. And her name, her employee ID, her documented identity, had been used to build that obscurement. "They used my credentials," she said. "Yes, to cover a physician failure. That's what it looks like." She pushed off the wall. Her shoulder ached. She didn't acknowledge it. "Who else knows about this? Right now? Tonight?" "Colonel Nolan's office. Whoever sent me the screenshots. And you." He paused. "And whoever put the notes there in the first place." She called Ashworth at 7:18 from the hospital parking lot, sitting in her car with the heat running and the windows fogging slightly at the edges. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had been waiting. "The situation has changed," she said. "Tell me." She told him. Concisely, in the ordered way she relayed information, the Cass file, the falsified notes, her credentials used without authorization, the 6-hour documentation gap that had been papered over with her name. When she finished, the silence on his end lasted approximately 4 seconds. "That's not a protocol issue," he said. "That's fraud." "Yes." "And potentially contributory to a patient death." "Yes, Sarah." His voice had dropped into the register she associated with him making decisions that had weight. "This is past the Friday meeting. This is past the hospital's internal review process. This is a state board issue, possibly a criminal referral issue, and Colonel Nolan's office needs to know tonight. She already knows about the Odom documentation. I need to call her back."
"I'll make a parallel call. She needs to hear this from both of us." A pause. "I want you to go home. Lock your personal records, the originals, not copies, somewhere secure. Send digital backups to a personal email and to mine. Do it tonight." "Already planned." "I know," he said. "I'm saying it anyway."
She drove home. She made the copies. She sent them. She made the call to Colonel Nolan, who was still in her office at 7:45 in the evening DC time, which told Sarah something about the priority level this investigation had already reached. Nolan listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, the colonel said, "Can you verify definitively that you were not assigned to Cass on the night in question?" "I have my personal shift records. I was not scheduled for Bay 7 that night. I was in Bays 2 and 4. "Do you have the hospital's official scheduling records?" "I can get them. They're in the employee portal." "Get them tonight. Screenshot, timestamp, don't alter anything." A pause. "Ms. Voss, I want to be clear about what I'm telling you next. What you've described, the use of your credentials to falsify clinical documentation in connection with a patient death, that removes this from the category of institutional patient safety review and puts it in the category of a potential criminal investigation. The Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies will need to be notified. So will the State Board of Nursing, not because you're under investigation, but because your professional credentials have been compromised." "Bashiste, I understand. This also means you cannot go into that hospital tomorrow and behave as though this evening didn't happen. You need legal representation. Do you have an attorney?" She did not have an attorney. She had a shoebox with a silver star in it and 6 years of meticulously kept notes and a USB drive from a resident with a conscience, and apparently she needed an attorney. "I'll find one," she said. "I can give you a referral," Nolan said. "Someone who handles military and medical whistleblower cases." "Good. Discreet. Works fast." She took the name. Friday arrived in the way days arrived when you had not slept well since. Present, insistent, slightly too bright. Sarah had slept 4 hours, woken at 3 with the particular alertness of someone whose nervous system had not received the message that it was still nighttime, and spent the hours between 3 and 6 reviewing documents at her kitchen table with the methodical focus of someone preparing a position for an engagement. She was not going into that hospital without knowing exactly what she was walking into. The attorney Nolan had referred, a woman named Diane Marsh, Denver-based, who answered her phone at 8 in the morning with the brisk readiness of someone for whom early calls were not unusual, spent 40 minutes with Sarah by phone, and at the end of it said, "Don't go in today, not until I've spoken with the hospital's legal team. I'm still technically on staff until the suspension takes effect, which is why they might expect you to come in and why you shouldn't. Let me make the first contact. It changes the dynamic." Sarah understood changing dynamics. "All right. Send me everything you sent to General Ashworth. Tonight's backup, the shift records, the Odom notes, all of it. Sent. I'll call you before noon." She did not go to the hospital. She went for a run instead, something she did badly and infrequently, but that had the advantage of being an activity that required her body to be doing something while her mind worked, which was preferable to sitting still. She ran 2 miles up a trail that started behind her apartment complex and climbed into the lower edge of the pine tree line, and at the top she stood looking at Delwood spread out below her and thought about Raymond Cass, 61 years old, who had come to Mercy Crest for a routine procedure and had died while a 6-hour deterioration was papered over with someone else's name. She thought about his family, who likely believed, because the record said so, that a nurse had checked on him and found him acceptable when he was not acceptable. She thought about what that belief had done to those people, whether it had changed how they understood his death, whether it had made them accept as natural something that was not natural, whether it had foreclosed questions they deserved to be asking. That, more than anything else in the past week, made the cold in her chest something she recognized as anger. Not the reactive kind. The particular anger of someone who had been patient for a long time and had arrived at the conclusion that patience had a limit, and the limit was the moment when silence enabled ongoing harm. She ran back down. She showered. She waited for Diane Marsh to call. Marsh called at 11:47. "I've spoken with the hospital's legal counsel," she said. "The conversation was interesting." "In what way?" "In the way that conversations are interesting when the other party realizes mid-call that their situation is considerably worse than they thought it was when they picked up the phone." A pause with a quality of professional satisfaction in it. They were expecting a nursing protocol dispute. They were not expecting falsified credentials in connection with a patient death. Their counsel asked for 48 hours to conduct an internal review before any further action. "Did you give it to them?" "I gave them 24. With the condition that all relevant personnel remain in their current positions, no terminations, no reassignments, no document access changes during that period. I also told them that Colonel Nolan's office had already received the core documentation and that the state board notification was proceeding on its own timeline, regardless of their internal review." "How did they respond to that?" "Quietly," Marsh said. "The kind of quiet that means people in a room are doing math and not liking the answers." Another pause. "Sarah, I want to prepare you for something. When institutions get to this point, when the documentation is solid and the federal jurisdiction is established and there is no version of events in which the internal cover works, they pivot, they stop defending, and they start calculating who to offer up." "Holt," Sarah said. "Almost certainly. The question is whether they try to include you in that calculation, whether they attempt to position you as complicit, someone who knew about the falsified records and sat on the information for reasons that could be characterized as self-interest. I didn't know about the CAS records until Thursday evening. I know. And your documentation trail proves you didn't. But I want you to understand that the defense they build for Holt, and he will have his own attorney by now, probably had one by last night, may involve constructing a version of events in which you had access to information you withheld." Sarah thought about this. She thought about the 6 years of notes on her laptop and her phone, and now in General Ashworth's email and Diane Marsh's inbox. She thought about the particular comprehensiveness of a record kept by someone who was paying attention. "They're welcome to try," she said. That. She was at her kitchen table at 2 in the afternoon when Marcus Webb texted, "Holt didn't come in today. Word is he called in sick. First sick day in 4 years, according to the clerk." She replied, "I know." Then, 40 minutes later, a second text from a number she'd stored as Nolan SG. Colorado Dora notified as of this morning. State board notification filed. Hospital has been formally advised. Suggest you prepare for Monday. Monday, 4 days away. Which meant the weekend existed in a kind of liminal space in which everything had been set in motion and nothing had yet landed. She made tea. She called her sister, who asked about Thanksgiving plans, and Sarah said she didn't know yet, which was true. She did not tell her sister about any of the rest of it because her sister worried with an intensity that was loving and exhausting in equal measure, and the story had too many moving parts to compress into a phone call without causing that worry to spike to unmanageable levels. She ate dinner. She slept 7 hours, which was better. Monday arrived. Sarah had not been called in. Her suspension was technically in effect. She drove to the hospital anyway. Not to go to the floor, but because Diane Marsh had arranged a meeting with Warren Fitch and the hospital's legal team, and Marsh had told her to be present in person because presence mattered in these conversations in ways that phone lines did not replicate. The meeting was at 9. She arrived at 8:50. She wore the same thing she wore everywhere, jeans, thermal, fleece, because she was not performing anything for anyone, and the clothes she wore to work were the clothes she wore. And the day she dressed differently to impress a room full of people who had spent 6 years calling her the overnight girl would be a different day than this one. Diane Marsh was already in the lobby. She was 52, compact, with the kind of posture that came from years of standing in rooms and not needing anyone to give her permission to stand there. She shook Sarah's hand and said, "The hospital's counsel has been on the phone with Dora since Saturday. They've been trying to get ahead of the state board timeline. So far they haven't succeeded." "Is Holt here?" He's in the building. His personal attorney is also in the building. A pause. General Ashworth is in the parking lot. I told him, you told him to stay out on Friday. Today is Monday. Marsh held her gaze. Let him be in the parking lot, Sarah. It matters to him to be here. She understood that. She said, all right. The conference room had even more people in it than the Thursday meeting. Warren Fitch, visibly diminished from his usual managerial confidence in the way people got when their frameworks were being actively dismantled. Dr. Greer, who had clearly not slept a great deal over the weekend. Paula, from HR, who was present in the way HR was always present at difficult meetings, with her notepad and her careful expressions. The hospital's legal counsel, a trim man named Foster, who had the studied neutrality of a professional whose job required him not to react visibly to things. And Dr. Holt. He was present in the way that people were present when they had been reduced. Still in the chair, still in the room, but taking up less space than he usually did, as if some essential inflation had leaked out overnight. He had his own attorney beside him, a woman who had the adversarial stillness of someone ready to object the moment anything went a direction she didn't want. Sarah sat. Marsh sat beside her. Thank you all for being here, Warren said, and then paused in a way that suggested he was aware of how inadequate that opening was, but couldn't find a better one. Foster took over. He laid out the hospital's position with the specific care of someone arranging items they were afraid of dropping. The internal review conducted over the weekend, the findings regarding documentation irregularities in the CAS file, the finding that Ms. Voss's credentials had been used to generate nursing notes during a shift she was not assigned to. The hospital's conclusion that this represented an unauthorized use of employee credentials in violation of multiple institutional policies. He did not say Holt's name once in the first 5 minutes. Who generated the notes? Marsh asked. Foster glanced at Holt's attorney. That's under review, Foster said. It's under review with Dora, Marsh said pleasantly. I'm asking who generated them in this room, in this conversation, right now. The silence had the quality of a room collectively deciding something. The access logs, Greer said. She said it quietly, not looking at Holt. The access logs from the documentation system show the notes were entered from a terminal in the physician's dictation room on the night of March 14th, between 3:15 and 3:50 a.m. Who had access to that terminal on the night of March 14th? Marsh asked. Another silence. Dr. Holt, Greer said. He was the attending of record. Holt's attorney put a hand briefly on his arm. Holt did not speak. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man who had known this morning was coming and had spent the weekend bargaining with the reality of it in ways that had not produced a workable alternative. I'd like to understand, Marsh said, turning to Holt directly, why a physician's dictation terminal was used to generate nursing notes under a different employee's credentials. Holt's attorney said, my client is not in a position to answer questions in this form. Your client is in a position, Marsh said, to understand that the State Board of Nursing has been notified that his employee's professional credentials were used to create false documentation in connection with a patient death. That's not a question. That's a statement of fact. Warren Fitch cleared his throat. He looked at Holt with the expression of someone who had made a decision, a difficult one, arrived at over a difficult weekend, and was now in the process of implementing it. Reginald, he said. It was the first time Sarah had ever heard Warren Fitch use Holt's first name without the prefix. I need you to understand that the board met yesterday. Given the findings of the internal review, your surgical privileges at this institution have been suspended effective immediately, pending the outcome of the Dora investigation. The room was very quiet. Holt looked up. For the first time since Sarah had entered the room, he looked up and directly at the people around the table, and the expression on his face was not the one she would have expected, not anger, not the blustering authority she had watched him deploy for 6 years. It was something smaller and more human than that, something that looked like a man confronting the specific weight of what he had done, which was not the same as remorse, but was perhaps a prerequisite for it. He did not speak. His attorney made a note. There will be a formal hearing, Foster said. The findings will be shared with the Colorado Medical Board. The Cass family has been contacted and will be receiving a full accounting. Sarah thought of Raymond Cass, of the family who had been carrying a false version of his death for 8 months. She did not feel triumphant about this moment. She felt something closer to the exhaustion of a long and necessary effort reaching a point where its necessity was finally being acknowledged.
Ms. Voss, Warren said, turning to her, the suspension notice issued Thursday is hereby withdrawn, effective immediately. He paused. And I want to say, on behalf of the hospital, that the use of your credentials without authorization was a serious violation of your professional identity and your legal rights, and the institution takes full responsibility for the failure of its systems to prevent it, formally and on the record. Marsh made a note. There's one more thing, Greer said. Everyone looked at her. The nursing board will need to be formally notified that the cast documentation was not generated by Ms. Voss. That's a separate process from the Dora investigation, and it needs to happen today, not as a result of the investigation timeline. She looked at Foster. Today. Agreed, Foster said. And, Greer continued with the air of someone who had been holding something and had decided the moment to say it had arrived. I'd like it noted, in this room, in the minutes from this meeting, that the clinical findings from the Reeves case have been formally reviewed and confirmed that the emergency intervention was initiated and directed by Sarah Voss, and that the outcome for the patient was a direct result of her judgment and her skill. She looked at Sarah. That should have been in the record from the beginning. I'm sorry it wasn't. The room absorbed this. Sarah did not fill the silence. She was not going to fill it with gratitude or with minimization or with any of the responses that rooms like this had trained her over 6 years to produce. She acknowledged what Greer said with a single nod, which was the response it deserved. Recognition, acceptance, not performance. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, producing a sequence of decisions that Marsh was documenting with focused precision and that Sarah tracked with equal precision because decisions made in rooms mattered, and she had learned long ago not to trust them to memory alone. At the end of it, Foster stood and shook hands with Marsh and made the controlled exit of a legal professional who had survived a difficult situation with minimal visible damage. Holt's attorney guided Holt out a side door, which meant she had assessed that a direct exit through the main corridor was not tactically wise. Warren Fitch walked around the table to where Sarah was still seated. I know this doesn't cover 6 years, he said. No, she agreed. I'd like to talk about what does, he said. When you're ready. Not today, but soon. She looked at him. At the complicated reality of a man who had run an institution in a way that had required a federal investigation and a military salute and a patient death and a criminally falsified record to correct, and who was now standing in front of her with the genuine, if belated, intention to make something right. People were complicated. Institutions were worse. Neither fact excused anything, and neither made repair impossible. Schedule something with Diane, she said. We'll talk. She stood. She and Marsh walked out together. In the hallway outside the conference room, Marlo Diaz was standing with the look of someone who had been told to wait and had been doing exactly that while time moved in ways she couldn't control. She looked at Sarah. Well, she said. Holt's privileges are suspended, Sarah said. The nursing board is being notified today that the cast documentation isn't mine. The suspension notice is withdrawn. Marlo let out a breath that had clearly been stored for several days. Thank God. She caught herself. Sorry, It's fine, Marlo. What happens now? Sarah thought about it. About what happened now, which was a question with multiple answers at multiple scales. What happened to Holt, to the Cass family, to the Odom case, to the patients who had been served by a system that had been quietly and systematically making its failures disappear for years. Now, she said, it gets fixed. She pushed through the door to the main corridor. The ICU was 50 feet away. The nursing station, the bays, the monitors that beeped their rhythms regardless of what was happening in conference rooms. Her floor. Her patients. She was halfway down the corridor when her phone buzzed. It was a text from a number she'd saved as Nolan SG 3 days ago, which she had come to associate with the particular combination of brevity and consequence that characterized official military communication. It read, Review complete. Board convened this morning. Formal report submitted. Call me when you can. There's a conversation we need to have about what comes next. Not a small one. She read it twice. Then she looked up. At the end of the corridor, through the ICU door's small windows, she could see the nursing station and the movement of the floor going about its work.
the steady, urgent, imperfect work of keeping people alive. She had done that work for 6 years in this building, without anyone knowing the full weight of what she brought to it. Something was about to change. She could feel it in the specific way you felt inflection points, not as drama, but as the quiet certainty that the thing happening right now would divide time into before and after. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Warren Fitch's direct line. She looked at the ICU doors. She looked at the phone. She answered. "Warren, Sarah?" He cleared his throat. "I just came from a call with the board. There's a position we need to discuss. Immediately, if possible." He paused. "It's not a small offer." "Not a small offer," she repeated. "No." Warren's voice had the quality of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say and was now discovering that the rehearsal hadn't fully prepared them for the real thing. "The board met this morning. Emergency session, given everything. We need to discuss the chief clinical director position, emergency trauma division." Sarah stood in the corridor for a moment with the phone against her ear and the ICU doors in front of her, and the particular stillness she got when something large arrived that she had not let herself anticipate. "That position doesn't exist," she said. "It will," Warren said, "by end of week, if you say yes." She looked at the floor, at the scuff marks on the linoleum, the same marks that had been there for 6 years because nobody filed the maintenance request until someone else did. At the entirely ordinary surface of a place where she had done extraordinary work in invisibility for longer than most people lasted. "I'll call you back in an hour," she said. Of course. She hung up. She stood in the corridor for approximately 30 seconds, doing nothing except breathing and being present in the specific way she'd learned to be present when things were moving faster than the speed at which she was prepared to absorb them, not shutting it out, not rushing forward into it, just holding it. Then she pushed through the ICU doors and went to find Marlo. But Marlo was at the nursing station doing what Marlo did, managing the surface of the floor with the particular focused energy that was her best quality, the thing Sarah had never doubted about her even when everything else between them was complicated. She looked up when Sarah came through. "What did Fitch want?" "I need to use the small conference room for an hour," Sarah said. "Can you cover?" Marlo looked at her face. Whatever she read there made her stop the clipboard motion entirely. "Yes, go." Sarah went to the small conference room and closed the door and sat at the table that had been the site of a very different conversation the previous week, and she called General Ashworth. He answered from the parking lot, which meant he had been sitting in his car for the better part of 2 hours. She found that both touching and entirely consistent with who he was. "Fitch called," she said. "I know. He called me first, apparently to gauge whether the offer was something you'd be willing to consider. I told him I had no idea and that he should ask you." A pause. "Which is the truth?" "Chief Clinical Director, Emergency Trauma." "That's what he told me. It's a new position. Created for the situation." He paused. "And for you specifically, though I'd imagine that's not how he phrased it. He phrased it as what the hospital needs, which is also true. A silence with some texture to it. What are you thinking?" She looked at the whiteboard on the wall, the marker stains that hadn't erased. She had looked at this whiteboard in this room under very different circumstances, and she was looking at it now, and the room was the same room, and she was not the same person, or rather she was exactly the same person, but the room's relationship to her had changed, and the distinction mattered. "I'm thinking," she said, "that if I leave, the problems don't get fixed. They get managed. Which is what they've been doing, managing, containing, papering over. If I stay, I have a chance to actually change what happens to patients in this building. That's one way to think about it. What's the other way? That you've spent 6 years in a place that systematically undervalued you and used your professional identity without your consent to cover up a man's death, and you could walk out of that building today with your head up and your record clear and take any position in the country." She was quiet for a moment. "You have something specific in mind. Colonel Nolan's office. The conversation she wants to have with you." He paused. "There's a trauma advisory role. Federal. It would involve developing training protocols for military to civilian medical transition, specifically for combat medics coming back to civilian practice. People like you. People who come back with skills that the civilian system doesn't know how to use and systematically underutilizes. She held that. That's not a small thing either, she said. No, it is not. Outside the conference room, the floor moved through its rhythms. She could hear the muffled beep of monitors, the particular sliding door sound of the ICU bay entrances, the low register of clinical voices doing the work of keeping people alive. She had been part of that sound for 6 years. It was, she realized, genuinely hers. Not the building's, not the institution's, hers. The building had tried to erase her from it, had tried to put her name on things that weren't hers and keep her name off things that were, and it had not managed either. Let me ask you something, she said. Go ahead. The combat medics coming back, the ones the system doesn't know how to use. She paused. How many? Ashworth was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when the answer was significant. Hundreds, per year, cycling out with trauma skills that take years to build and ending up doing paperwork, or leaving medicine entirely because the civilian credentialing system treats them like new graduates. Another pause. Because nobody built a proper bridge. She thought about that. About hundreds of people who had done what she had done, had come back from places they couldn't name on forms with skills that didn't have clean civilian equivalents, and had spent years making themselves small in systems that didn't know how to see them. About what it would mean to build the bridge. I need to make 2 calls, she said. Give me an hour. I'll be in the parking lot, he said, which was exactly what she'd expected. Yeah. The first call was to Diane Marsh. The offer, Marsh said when Sarah described it. Is it in writing yet? Not yet. Get it in writing before you decide anything. And when you get it, send it to me before you sign it. The scope of authority matters. What you can actually do in that role versus what the title implies. A pause. Also the indemnification question. After what happened with your credentials, you need to understand what legal protection the position carries if something like that is ever attempted again. I know. If the scope is real, Marsh said, and the authority is genuine, and they're putting it in writing, that's meaningful. Not because it fixes 6 years, nothing fixes 6 years, but because it might mean the next 6 years look different, for you and for the patients. That's what I'm weighing. Sarah. Marsh's voice shifted slightly. Still professional, but something underneath it that was more personal. I've worked whistleblower cases for 15 years. I've watched people go through what you've gone through and walk out with settlements and press statements, and then 6 months later they're isolated and quietly pushed out, and the institution returns to exactly what it was. That's the pattern. A pause. But I've also seen it go the other way. Not often, but when the person who blows the whistle is also the person they need to run the new system, when the institution can't fix itself without them, then sometimes the change is real. How do you know which is which? You look at whether they're offering you the power to fire the people who created the problem, Marsh said. If the answer is yes, it might be real. Sarah sat with that. Get it in writing, Marsh said again. Then call me. The second call was to Colonel Nolan. Nolan answered with the same brisk readiness as the first time, and Sarah appreciated the consistency of it, the absence of preamble, the willingness to be direct. The federal role, Sarah said. The trauma advisory position. Yes. I want to understand what it looks like in practice. Not the title. What I'd actually be doing. Nolan talked for 7 minutes without stopping, which Sarah took as a sign that she had been thinking about this for a while and had been waiting for the right person to ask. The role would involve reviewing current credentialing pathways for transitioning combat medics, identifying the specific gaps between military trauma qualifications and civilian nursing and paramedicine requirements, and building, from mostly scratch, a set of bridge protocols that would allow people with genuine field experience to enter civilian medicine at a level commensurate with their actual skills rather than their paperwork. There are people cycling out right now, Nolan said, with more real trauma experience than most ER attendings, who are being told to start from the beginning because they don't have the right civilian certifications. We lose them. They go into other industries. The civilian medical system loses exactly the kind of hands-on competency it's chronically short on, and the people themselves lose the professional identity that was central to who they were. A pause. You know this better than I do. I do. The question is whether you want to fix it from inside Mercy Crest or from inside the federal structure. Those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, Sarah said. Nolan was quiet for a moment. No, she said. They're not. She went back to Warren's call at 11:47 and told him she needed the offer in writing by end of day. He said it would be in her email by 3. She told him she'd respond by close of business tomorrow. Then she went to the floor. Not to work. She was technically on administrative leave until the formal withdrawal of the suspension was processed, which Marsh had told her would take until Wednesday. She went to the floor because there was someone she needed to see. Danny Reeves was in a standard room now, 2 floors down from the ICU, in the phase of recovery that was mostly bureaucratic. Discharge paperwork, follow-up scheduling, the compression of a near-death experience into a series of checkboxes that somehow never quite fit around the actual human size of what had happened. His mother had finally gone home to sleep in her own bed for the first time in a week. His sister's plant was still on the windowsill, still slightly too large for it. He looked better. Color had returned in the way it returned to young people, completely, almost defiantly, as if the body were making a point. He looked at her when she came in. "You're not my nurse today." "No," she said. "I just wanted to see how you were doing." "Discharge is tomorrow." He shifted against the pillows. "My CO called this morning. I'm getting 6 weeks of recovery leave, then back to evaluation for return to duty. How do you feel about that?" "Honestly?" He considered. "Weird. Good weird. I thought I was going to die on a highway in Colorado, which felt like a stupid way to go after everything else." He paused. "What's happening with you?" General Ashworth wouldn't tell me details, but he had an expression. Ashworth always has an expression. This was a specific one. He watched her. The one he gets when things are complicated but going right. She looked at the plan on the windowsill, at the particular stubborn vitality of a thing that had been placed somewhere slightly too small for it and had simply kept going anyway. "Things are going right," she said. "Good." He said it simply, without performance. "You should know. I wrote a formal statement. For whatever review is happening, I wrote exactly what I remember from the trauma bay." He met her eyes directly. "You saved my life. That's in a federal document now. Permanent record." She didn't know what to do with that in the conventional sense. Didn't know how to receive it the way people receive things that mattered. She had been practicing not receiving things for 6 years, and the practice was thorough. "Take care of yourself, Corporal," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then, with the particular instinct of someone who had spent years reading rooms, "Staff Sergeant." She walked out. And the offer arrived in her email at 2:47 p.m. She forwarded it to Marsh without reading it fully. Marsh called back at 4:15. "Read it," Marsh said. "All of it. Then tell me what you think." She read it. Chief Clinical Director, Emergency Trauma Division. Newly established position, reporting to the Chief of Medical Staff, which meant Dr. Greer, not Warren Fitch, which was structurally significant. Scope of authority included oversight of all emergency trauma protocols, authority to initiate and lead protocol review processes, direct input into staff credentialing evaluations for the trauma division, and here was the thing Marsh had told her to look for: explicit authorization to recommend disciplinary action up to and including termination for any clinical staff member within the division whose practice fell below established safety standards. The power to fire the people who created the problem. There was also a clause she hadn't expected, a line at the end of the compensation section, after the salary figure which was meaningfully higher than her current nursing pay. That read, "The hospital further commits to a formal institutional review of all incident reporting processes over the past 7 years, to be conducted by an independent third-party auditor, with results shared with DORA and made available to affected patients and families upon request." She sat at her kitchen table and read that line 3 times. They were committing to the audit. Publicly, in a signed offer letter, meaning the families of patients who had been affected by suppressed reports, including Raymond Cass's family, including Patrice Odom's family, would have access to accurate information about what had happened to their people. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the thing she had been thinking about since she stood on the trail that morning and looked at the city below and thought about what those families had been carrying. She called Marsh back. The audit clause, she said. I saw it. Is it enforceable? I'm going to make sure it is, Marsh said. I'm going to redline 2 sections before you sign anything. The indemnification language needs strengthening, and the audit timeline needs a deadline. But the structural offer is real. The authority is real. A pause. Sarah. Yes. Take the night. Sleep on it. You don't have to decide anything tonight. I know, she said. She took the night. She slept on it. In the morning, she called Colonel Nolan and had a conversation that lasted 35 minutes and ended with an arrangement that was not what either of them had fully anticipated going in, but that both of them recognized as more useful than the alternatives. Sarah would take the Mercy Crest position. She would also, on a part-time consulting basis, contribute to the federal protocol development project that Nolan's office was building. The 2 things were not in conflict. They were, in fact, complementary. One fixed the local system from the inside. The other built the bridge that prevented the same problems from happening to the next generation of people who came back from places they couldn't name on forms and tried to find a place in civilian medicine that fit the actual shape of what they knew. I want it documented, Sarah said, that the consulting work is formal and transparent. Nothing backroom. Agreed entirely. And I want the bridge protocols to go through practitioner review before they're finalized. People who've actually made the transition, not just administrators and credentialing officers. That was always the plan, Nolan said. We just needed someone who knew both worlds to lead the review. A pause. That's you. She signed the Mercy Crest offer letter, Marsh's redlined version, which Warren Fitch's office accepted within an hour. On a Wednesday morning, sitting at her kitchen table with the same cold coffee and the same mountain view and the shoebox under her bed that still had a silver star in it, and was about to have some company from the framed copy of the appointment letter that Marsh told her she should keep somewhere she could see it. She was not going to frame the appointment letter, but she appreciated the thought. The formal staff announcement went out Thursday morning, hospital-wide, under Warren Fitch's signature. It named Sarah Voss as Chief Clinical Director of Emergency Trauma. It described the new division structure. It referenced in careful institutional language the independent audit that would be commencing the following month. What it did not do, and this was something Sarah had asked for explicitly, was frame the announcement as the conclusion of a conflict or the resolution of a dispute. She had asked Warren to write it as a beginning, not an ending, because that was what it actually was. He had. She arrived at Mercy Crest on Thursday morning for the first time in a week and went to the floor the way she always went to the floor, through the ICU doors, past the nursing station, with the particular awareness of the space that came from years of moving through it and knowing where everything was. The floor knew she was coming. Floors always knew. The specific quality of attention that met her when she walked in was different from anything she had experienced in this building. Not because people were performing something, but because the information had landed and people were responding to it genuinely, which meant some of them were surprised, and some of them were relieved, and some of them were doing the complicated recalibration that happened when a framework you'd been using turned out to have been missing a crucial variable for years. Marlo was at the nursing station. She looked at Sarah when she came through the doors, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. 6 years of a particular dynamic were present in the room between them. The accumulated weight of 1,000 small dismissals and 1,000 small absorptions, and the whole architecture of a relationship built on a fundamental misreading that had recently and dramatically corrected itself. "Good morning," Marlo said. "Good morning," Sarah said. It was not a reconciliation speech, and it was not a forgiveness ceremony. It was 2 women acknowledging each other at the start of a working day in a hospital where people needed care. That was enough. It was, in fact, the appropriate amount. The formal consequences for Reginald Holt arrived in stages, the way institutional consequences always did, not all at once, but in the accumulated, grinding way of processes that moved on their own timelines, regardless of how urgently anyone felt they should move faster. His surgical privileges at Mercy Crest remained suspended. The Colorado Medical Board opened a formal investigation within 10 days of the DORA notification. The falsified CAS documentation, the access logs placing the entry at his terminal, the credential misuse, the discrepancy between the filed incident report and the original system data that Marcus had preserved, was referred to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. That process was slower, as those processes were, and its outcome was not certain, because legal outcomes in complex institutional fraud cases rarely were. What was certain, he would not practice surgery at Mercy Crest again. The board's investigation would determine whether he would practice it anywhere. Marlo Diaz lost her management position at the charge nurse level, not because she had been complicit in the specific falsifications. She hadn't been. But because the audit that began the following month identified a pattern of incident reporting under her oversight that had consistently minimized nursing concerns and deferred to physician accounts in ways that had contributed to the conditions that allowed the larger pattern to persist. She was offered a return to clinical work as a staff nurse. She accepted. It was, Sarah thought, the right outcome. Not punitive enough to be vindictive, not lenient enough to suggest the oversight problems hadn't mattered. Marlo was a good nurse. She had been a limited manager. Those two facts could coexist. Marcus Webb's revised incident report was entered into the permanent record, along with a formal notation from the Chief of Medical Staff acknowledging his corrective disclosure. His residency evaluation, which Holt had been scheduled to complete, was reassigned to Dr. Greer. His standing in the program was unaffected. He would become, Sarah suspected, an excellent physician, specifically because he had been in a situation that had cost him something and had chosen correctly when it mattered, which was the actual curriculum that made people good at this work. The Cass family was contacted by the hospital's patient advocate and given a full accounting. Sarah was not present for that conversation. It was not hers to be present for. But she knew it happened because the audit coordinator sent her a confirmation as part of the process documentation. And she sat with that for a long moment when she read it, with the specific weight of something that had been wrong for 8 months finally being made, if not right, at least honest. Lenora Odom's attorney reached a settlement with the hospital on behalf of the Odom estate within 6 weeks. Sarah had no knowledge of the terms, which was appropriate. She knew it had happened because Lenora Odom appeared at the nursing station one morning, unannounced, and asked to speak with her. They sat in the small conference room, the same one, with the same marker-stained whiteboard, which Sarah had by now developed an oddly affectionate relationship with. Lenora was a compact woman with precise posture and the specific quality of stillness that came from having been through something difficult and having emerged from it in possession of herself. "I wanted to thank you in person," she said, "for documenting what you documented." "I'm sorry it took this long to matter," Sarah said. "It matters now." Lenora looked at her hands. Patrice recovered. She never knew how close. She doesn't know what the record said or didn't say. I'm the one who chased it. A pause. She thinks I'm just a worrier. You're not just a worrier. No. Something shifted in her face. The residue of months of fighting moving through her like weather clearing. You know what struck me? When I first got her records and saw the discrepancies, I almost let it go. I thought, she's fine. She recovered. What does it matter what the paperwork says? She looked at Sarah directly. Then I thought about the next person, the one who wasn't fine, who didn't recover, and I thought about whether the paperwork would matter for them. It mattered, Sarah said. It mattered for Raymond Cass. Lenora nodded. I heard about that. I'm sorry. His family deserved the truth. Yes. Lenora stood. She extended her hand. Sarah shook it. Keep your notes, Ms. Voss. I will. The first meeting Sarah called as Chief Clinical Director was not a strategy session or a protocol review or any of the things that new directors typically called their first meetings for. It was a nursing floor meeting. She called it for a Tuesday afternoon, and she told the floor coordinator to make attendance expected but not mandatory, and she had no agenda circulated in advance because she didn't have an agenda. She had things she wanted to say, and she wanted to say them directly, without the mediation of a formatted document. 14 nurses showed up, 2 residents, the respiratory therapist who always lingered, Brandon the unit clerk, who arrived 5 minutes early and sat in the back. She stood at the front of the room, not behind the table, beside it. I'm going to be direct with you, she said, because I think directness is what this floor has been missing, and I'm not willing to manage that absence the same way it was managed before. She told them what she was doing and why and what she expected the work to look like going forward, not in the language of institutional mission statements, but in the specific concrete terms of clinical practice. What good incident reporting looked like, what it meant to raise a concern about a physician's decision and have that concern taken seriously. What documentation was actually for, which was not to cover the institution but to protect the patient and protect the nurse, and how those two things were supposed to be the same thing and had been made into different things by a culture she intended to dismantle. She told them that the audit was real and that its findings would be shared with them, not just with administration, because they deserved to understand the system they'd been working inside. She told them that the position she was in carried authority she intended to use, and that if anyone in the room had concerns they'd been sitting on, her door would be open and she would take them seriously, and she would back them up, when backing them up was the right call. "I've been on this floor for 6 years," she said. "I know what the problems are, I know where the corners get cut, and I know which decisions get made out of institutional convenience rather than clinical judgment. I'm not interested in performative fixes. I'm interested in whether the next patient who comes through those trauma bay doors leaves alive when they're supposed to leave alive." She paused. "That's all I have. If you have questions, I'll stay." 7 people stayed. The questions were specific and real, and several of them were the kind of questions that required uncomfortable honesty, which she gave. One of the nurses, a woman named Terry, who'd been on the floor as long as Sarah and had a sharp, unsentimental quality that Sarah had always respected from a distance, asked, "What happens when a physician pushes back on a nursing concern? Like actually pushes back, not in a polite way." "It gets documented," Sarah said, "and then it gets escalated. And I am the escalation point." A pause. "Nobody in this building gets to make a nurse feel like her clinical judgment is irrelevant because she doesn't have MD after her name. That's over." Terry looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone who had been waiting to hear something said plainly for a very long time and was absorbing the fact that it had finally been said. General Ashworth came to the hospital one more time, 3 weeks after everything had settled into its new shape. Not officially. He came in civilian clothes, which meant a fleece similar to hers and hiking pants and the specific quality of anonymity that certain kinds of very capable people could project when they chose to. He found her in the break room on her lunch break, which she was spending with a sandwich and a clinical protocol document she was marking up with a red pen. He sat down across from her. "You look different," he said. "Same scrubs?" "Not the scrubs." He studied her face. "You look like yourself." She set down the red pen, looked at him across the break room table with its ring-stained surface and the coffee machine that was working again, and the motivational poster that someone had finally taken down and replaced with a whiteboard where the floor nurses left notes to each other, practical and sometimes funny. The genuine texture of people who work together every day. "I owe you something," she said. "You don't owe me?" "Not in the debt sense, in the honest sense." She met his eyes. "You came here to give me a reason to stop hiding. You could have called. You sent 3 men in dress uniforms to an ICU corridor because you knew I needed it to be undeniable." He was quiet for a moment. "Was I wrong?" She thought about the corridor, about the sound of boots on linoleum and a salute that had stopped the room's breathing, about the specific way it felt to stand up straight in a place that had spent years teaching her to stand smaller. "No," she said. "You weren't wrong. Then we're even." She picked up the red pen. She looked at the protocol document. She thought about the hundreds of people still cycling out of service with skills the system didn't know how to receive, and the bridge she was helping to build for them, which would be imperfect and slow and require fighting for every structural change, and would probably take longer than it should. She thought about what it meant to do necessary work without anyone watching, to keep records nobody had asked you to keep, to know the value of something you were carrying and carry it quietly anyway, not because nobody would believe you, but because the right moment to put it down hadn't arrived yet. "The protocol work," she said. "Nolan's bridge project. We need practitioners in the room, people who've done both. Will you help me identify them?" "Already started," he said. "Of course you have." He almost smiled. Actually, almost. He stood to leave, and at the break room door he paused with the deliberateness of someone who had thought about whether to say the next thing and had decided yes. "The silver star," he said. "It should be somewhere visible." "It's in a shoebox." "I know." A pause. "Take it out of the shoebox, Sarah." She looked at him.
At the door behind him and the corridor beyond it, and the floor where she worked and the building where she had remade the terms of her own visibility, one documented incident at a time over 6 years without anyone knowing that was what she was doing. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He left. She sat alone in the break room for another 4 minutes, eating the rest of her sandwich and marking up the protocol document. The coffee machine hummed. Somewhere on the floor, a monitor beeped its rhythm. She could hear Terry's voice at the nursing station, direct and efficient, handling something with the matter-of-fact competence that was what good nurses looked like when nobody was making them small. 2 months later, on a Friday in December when the mountains outside Delwood were fully white and the hospital parking lot required careful navigation, and the break room smelled like the holidays in the way break rooms did when people brought food to work because they were tired and cold. And that was how humans managed being tired and cold together. Sarah Voss walked into her office. She had an office now. It was not large. It had a window that faced the east parking lot, the same unremarkable view she'd seen from the hall window the day Ashworth walked with her away from the nursing station. She had put nothing on the walls because she'd been waiting until she knew what she wanted there, and this morning she had known. She took a frame out of her bag. She had found it at a hardware store 2 weeks ago. Simple, functional, not decorative. Inside it was the appointment letter, not because Marsh had told her to frame it, but because she'd decided on her own terms that it was worth looking at. She hung it on the wall opposite the desk. She stepped back and looked at it. Then she opened the bottom drawer, the one she'd designated for things that were personal and not for the general surfaces of the office. And she took out the shoebox. The silver star was inside it, same as it had always been. She held it for a moment. The weight was familiar. She had picked it up enough times to know it exactly. The specific heft of a thing that meant a particular kind of truth about a particular period of her life that she had carried alone for 9 years. She put it on the desk. Not displayed. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the performative sense. Just out of the box. Present in the room where she worked, where she made decisions about how patients were cared for and how nurses were treated and what this floor would look like for the people who came after her. She sat down at her desk. She opened the protocol document she'd been working on, the bridge framework, the one that was going to change how combat medics transitioned into civilian medicine. That was going to take 2 years to build properly and was going to be imperfect and contested and worth every argument. And she picked up her pen. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and that had never been the problem, and it wasn't the problem now. The problem for a long time had been the space between the work and the recognition of who was doing it. That space had closed. Not perfectly. It never closed perfectly, in any institution, for anyone, because institutions were made of people, and people were inconsistent, and history didn't clean up after itself without effort. But it had closed enough. Enough that the next nurse who came through those doors carrying something the building didn't know how to see would find, in the structure of the place, a different architecture than the one Sarah had spent 6 years navigating. That was not a small thing. It was not, honestly, the thing she'd set out to build when she showed up to her first overnight shift at Mercy Crest 6 years ago with a surgical scissors haircut and a shoebox she'd already learned not to open. She had set out to take care of patients and to keep her head down and to let the part of herself that had been forged in places she couldn't name on forms rest somewhere quiet. The quiet had not lasted. She would not have chosen what happened instead, given the choice. Would not have chosen the falsification or the suspension notice or Raymond Cass or any of it. But choice was rarely the operative mechanism. What you got was the situation in front of you, and what you did in it was the only thing that was actually yours. She had documented. She had waited. She had known the value of what she was carrying and carried it without showing it until the right moment, which had arrived in the form of a 23-year-old soldier with a chest injury and a military ID that connected the world she'd come from to the one she'd built. Some people spent years being invisible because the world decided they were. Some of them stayed invisible. Some of them built a record so thorough, so precise, so completely undeniable that when the moment came, the world had no choice but to see them. The difference, usually, was not talent. It was not luck. It was whether you kept going when the going was quiet, and whether you trusted in the silence that the work itself was enough. That doing it right in the dark was the same as doing it right in the light, and that eventually the light would find it. It always found it, if you didn't stop. Sarah Voss picked up her pen. She went to work.